Chapter 317. Shaving his beard. 2. Chu Lian was so stunned by the scene before her that she forgot to speak. In the next second, He Chang's bone-piercingly cold voice resounded throughout the small room. Put down the item and leave. He Changdi hadn't even turned around. He was still standing there in the bathtub. Even though there hadn't been any malice in his voice, Chu Lian still felt like someone had just dumped a basin of ice water over her head. She quickly regained her wits. Frustrated at herself for her loss of composure just now, Chu Lian quickly set down the razor on a table next to the screen and turned around. She hobbled as quickly as she could with one injured foot and left the room. Perhaps due to the provocation from He Chang's icy words, she didn't feel any of the pain coming from her injured ankle as she strode away. It wasn't until He Sanlang had heard those unique hobbling footsteps that he finally realized who had just come in. He froze up, then slapped the bathwater in frustration, scattering water all over the floor. He Sanlang let his body slide back into the bathtub and leaned against the side as he covered his face with a hand. He had just been in the middle of deep thought. When he had heard those light footsteps, he had assumed that it must have been some rude servant who had come in without saying anything. His temper had flared up on the spot. Who could have thought that it was Chu Lian, that lame wicked woman? When had that wicked woman become so reserved? Would she die if she didn't say something when entering the room? Wenlan heard the sound of footsteps and quickly went to the door to support Chu Lian, but when she arrived, she was met with a pair of puffed-up cheeks and an angry expression. Wenlan got a sinking feeling at the sight. Still, she asked, "Third young madam, what happened?" Chu Lian dropped back onto her seat by the hearth and harumphed. "I've been feeling rather hungry these few days. There aren't enough snacks to eat, even for just myself. Don't give any of them to your third young master later." The sheer amount of spite in Chu Lian's order was enough evidence for Wenlan to have a good guess of what had happened. It must have had something to do with third young master. Wenlan felt a little grudgeful towards He Changdi in her heart. Third young madam was a girl. She had been captured by the Tuhuns and suffered much while lost in the forest. The wound on her leg hadn't even healed properly yet. In this situation, third young master as her husband should be trying to pamper her a little, or at least accommodate for her injury and mental state and be a little nicer. Instead, he had gone and made her angry. Even though Wenlan was taking Chu Lian's side on this matter, she and Wenqing had served He Sanlang ever since they were children. She still wasn't willing to let her master suffer back at camp. Thus, she attempted to persuade Chu Lian into rescinding her command. "Third young madam, how could you possibly finish all of those snacks by yourself?" Before Wenlan could finish, she noticed that Chu Lian had redirected her gaze towards her and was now sizing her up. Wenlan suffered a fright and quickly looked down, not daring to continue. "Wenlan, if you continue your sentence, you can eat in the main kitchen from now on." The corner of Wenlan's mouth twitched. She was already used to Chu Lian's higher standards for food. How could she possibly withstand eating normal fare instead? She meekly replied in agreement. "Third young master, this servant has tried her best. The rest is up to you." As compared to fulfilling He Chang's wants, it was more important to satisfy her own appetite first. Having a good meal to eat was of the highest priority. Wenlan sent a silent apology to He Changdi. After Chu Lian took a seat, she realized that the wounds on her ankle had started bleeding again due to the force she had exerted while walking away just now. When Wenlan discovered this, she suffered another fright and quickly ran off to find some ointments to wrap up her madam's ankle again. Chapter 318. Shaving his beard. 3. He Sanlang didn't continue bathing for much longer. He changed into the new underclothes and cloak that Chu Lian had instructed the servants to prepare. As for his armor, he would put that on right before leaving for camp. He Changdi haphazardly dried his hair with a cloth before using a wooden hairpin to tie it up. Then, he carefully removed all the facial hair on his face, returning to his neat and clean appearance from before. He Sanlang was just 20 years old this year. After staying in the northern border for a few months, he had managed to grow even taller. His features had also become more mature and outstanding. The narrow shape of his eyes, shaded by his long eyelashes, accentuated the deep pools within. He Sanlang rubbed his clean chin. He felt a little uncomfortable suddenly, as if he had taken off a mask that he had been wearing for a long time. However, he quickly calmed back down and took a moment at the door to straighten out his slightly rumpled clothes. Only then did he push open the door and re-enter. At the moment Changdi entered the room, Chu Lian was still drinking her medicine. The medicinal soup was very bitter. When it touched her tongue, her face wrinkled up in distaste. Changdi watched from the entrance as she drank the whole bowl of medicine down with difficulty. Although Chu Lian hated drinking these Chinese medicines, she knew they were necessary and never rejected them. However, that didn't mean she had to like them. She would always eat a few candied dates to wash away their bitter aftertaste. A glint flashed across Changdi's eyes. He watched as Chu Lian finished her medicine and then proceeded to begin eating a few preserved fruits from a small dish, all without noticing him. When Changdi felt that he would continue to go unseen, he coughed twice on purpose. Thanks to those coughs, Sanlang successfully drew Chu Lian's attention. Changdi saw those wide, almond-shaped eyes of hers turn his way, and then, she spoke. "Has husband caught a cold? Wenlan, tell the kitchen to prepare a bowl of ginger soup. The more ginger the better." Changdi saw that her moist eyes seemed cool without any hint of admiration, unlike the way she had looked at Tang Yang. A trace of disappointment flashed through his eyes. When he heard her order the servants to boil a bowl of ginger soup for him next, Changdi choked. His originally cold face contorted as the hands resting by his side twitched. He walked over to Chu Lian's side and sat down heavily. Frustration bloomed in Changdi's heart. How could she not know that he didn't like to eat ginger? She actually told the servants to cook ginger soup for him. That wicked woman must have done it on purpose. Although Sanlang was angry inside, he found that he just couldn't muster up any fire when he sat next to Chu Lian like this. "There's no need for that, I'm perfectly fine." Chu Lian didn't even bother looking at him and even turned away, showing her back to him as she leaned on the hearth. Changdi's handsome face turned gloomy. The hand he had placed on the table curled up into a fist. He had just bathed and his mouth was dry. In his frustration, he didn't think carefully and picked up a teacup filled with water from the small table at the side. He immediately gulped it down, and in the next moment, his mouth was flooded with a sweet, fragrant flavor. It was only then that Sanlang realized this was most likely Chu Lian's teacup. That darned wicked woman. She normally loved drinking honey water. Changdi didn't like sweet things. He didn't eat anything that had the slightest bit of sweetness in them. However, at this moment, he actually thought that this sweet honey water was rather delicious. His eyes fell upon Chu Lian's soft, luscious lips without his conscious bidding. Chapter 319, Shaving His Beard. 4. Chu Lian liked to drink something while reading. Wenqing and Wenlan knew her habits well, so they never served her censure. They only ever prepared honey water for her. The hearth was burning in the room, so it was a little dry and hot. As Chu Lian stared at the county records, her other hand unconsciously moved for the teacup placed on the side table. However, her hand didn't meet the smooth surface of the cup. Instead, she touched something warm. She jumped in fright and turned to look. Sanlang had just set down the teacup, feeling a little unsatisfied. He hadn't moved his hand from the teacup yet when Chu Lian's fair and tender hand had covered his. His pupils constricted, but he didn't draw his hand back and he let her touch it as much as she liked. When Chu Lian realized that her hand was on Sanlang's, she gaped in shock and it took her a moment to pull her hand back. Chu Lian panicked. She rushed to explain, I didn't do that on purpose, I just wanted to drink some water." Changdi's head was slightly lowered. From the corner of his eyes, he caught sight of her flushed neck, and his mood mysteriously got a little better. "I just finished it. Have the maidservants come in to pour another." Chu Lian opened her mouth, but she ultimately decided against uttering the protest, "It's my cup." This time, she specially instructed Wenlan to bring 2 cups of water in. In the time that the couple waited patiently for Wenlan to send in the cups of water, they didn't speak at all. Changdi sat on the other side of the hearth bed. He leaned against the headboard and shut his eyes. Chu Lian couldn't tell if he was sleeping or thinking. She felt awkward, but she could only bear with it and continue reading while curled up at the other side of the hearth. Chu Lian looked down and forced herself to continue reading the county records. She didn't dare to even look at He Changdi before Whelan came back. Thus, she didn't realize that He Sanlang had been carefully observing her with narrowed eyes. Ever since the two of them had gotten married, they had rarely gotten the chance to be alone together. Wenqing and Wenlan were very happy about this. When Wenlan came in to deliver their drinks, she didn't even dare to stay for more than a second. She set down the teapot and quickly retreated. Senior servant Zhong had instructed Wenqing and Wenlan about He Changdi's likes and dislikes, so they knew that he didn't like sweet things. The honey water that they had made for him was very light. Meanwhile, Chu Lian preferred stronger tastes and liked both spicy and sweet things. The color of the honey water in the cups was different. Chu Lian's was slightly darker while He Changdi's was light. He Changdi didn't move. He watched as Chu Lian picked up her teacup and sipped a little from its edge. Her soft, pink lips were now glossy from the water and glistened in the light. He abruptly sat up and looked at the 2 cups of honey water. He feigned a solemn mask and asked, "Why does the water in these 2 cups look different? Could they taste different as well? The honey water in your cup looks tastier." After saying so, before Chu Lian could reply, he took the cup that Chu Lian had just drank from and took a sip from it. When he finished drinking, he picked up his own cup and tasted it before shaking his head. In the end, he moved Chu Lian's cup to his side. "I'll have this one." Chu Lian was stunned from his sudden string of actions. Her almond-shaped eyes were wide open as she stared at her lunatic husband with a weirded-out expression. He Changdi felt a little uncomfortable being stared at like that by Chu Lian. He knew very well that his actions had been a little strange just now. In order to cover up his actions, he ended up drinking both cups of honey water. The result of doing so? He Changdi was already full from honey water before it was even time for dinner. He Changdi only left when it turned to dusk, bringing his 2 subordinates along with him. Before he left, he called Mo Chenggui, Huang Zhijian, and Manager Qin for a meeting. When Manager Qin came back, he had a suffering expression on his face. Chu Lian tried to ask about what had happened, but he only said that third young master had given him some orders and he couldn't reveal what they were to third young madam. Chapter 320, Barred from Entering Camp. 1. Chu Lian thought that He Changdi must have given them some sort of secret mission, so she stopped prying into the matter. When Manager Qin exited the parlor, he let out a terrible sigh. Manager Qin wondered what kind of fit third young master was having. He had ordered them to tell all the men in the estate that they weren't allowed to shave their facial hair, at all, as long as they remained in Liangju. Anyone who disobeyed the orders would be thrown out of the party. Manager Qin was only in his 20s this year. Now that he was working under Chu Lian, he was a main steward that plenty of people would respect. Just as he was thinking about settling down, the young master had given out this mysterious order. What was he going to do? With a face full of stubble, were any ladies going to take a liking to him? They were the innocent casualties of a series of unfortunate events. By the time He Changdi managed to rush back to the northern border camp, there was just a sliver of the setting sun left on the horizon. The army cooks would have just started preparing dinner. The camp was at its busiest at this time, as it was around now that the soldiers also changed shifts. He Changdi pulled at his reins and urged his horse to slow down as they neared the wooden barricade surrounding the camp. The soldiers who had just taken their shifts stood by the entrance. Even though the cold winds had caused the tips of their noses to turn red, the grips they had on their spears hadn't loosened one bit. He Changdi didn't find anything wrong with this. He didn't bother to get off his horse and simply made his way forward as he normally would. However, before he could enter camp, 2 spears appeared in front of him and blocked his path. One of the soldiers lifted his chin and tried to make himself look imposing. He raised his voice and shouted, "Who are you and where did you come from? This is an army camp. Any trespassers will be killed." He Sanlang's freshly shaven face turned grave, making him look even more cold and stiff. Unfortunately, he didn't manage to scare the soldier blocking his way. The soldier's eyes turned into narrow slits. This person seemed a little familiar to him. However, beautiful people were difficult to forget, and he couldn't remember seeing a guy with this level of outstanding looks anywhere in camp. It was suspicious. Not only that, but the captain had reminded everyone to be on the alert. There had been an increase in Tu-Hoon spies lately. What if this person was one of them? Changdi's sharp eyebrows furrowed together. He reported his identity, the right-wing army's infantry captain Changdi. The two soldiers exchanged glances, their eyes full of suspicion. One of the soldiers harumphed. "Captain, he doesn't look like you at all. Stop talking nonsense and hand over your pass." Changdi's expression turned even darker. He had gone out on an investigation under the secret orders of Great General Qian, so he hadn't brought out his pass. How could he bring it out at this time? The two subordinates behind him were starting to get anxious. They tried to help explain, "Brothers, this is really Captain He. We're not trying to deceive you. If you don't believe us, you can ask for Captain Guo to identify him." The soldiers were still wary about their identities. One of the soldiers mumbled under his breath, "Do they think we're blind? Isn't Captain His face covered in a beard? This pretty boy doesn't look the slightest bit like our heroic Captain He." Even though they didn't believe the intruders, one of the soldiers still ran off to find someone who could verify their identities. Although the soldier had only been mumbling, Sanlang had still heard what he had said. A twitch developed in his eyes and he started to regret shaving away his beard. Sima Hui stepped out from the commander's tent, two of her female lieutenants by her side. She was being escorted out by the tall and burly Gao Jiangwei. "General Sima is a hero amongst women. With your help, I'm sure the Tu-Hoon soldiers will no longer be a threat to our border troops." Although Gao Jiangwei was tall, his eyes were narrow and long. His forehead stood out more than average. As he talked, his eyes kept drifting all over the place, landing from time to time on Sima Hui's chest and neck. Sima Hui was currently dressed in full battle attire. Although her skin wasn't as fair as most noble ladies, she was tall, with long legs and a full bust. Her long hair was tied up into a ponytail with a single red feather, and it dangled behind her back. She carried a heroic spirit in the arch of her brows. Her actions and words weren't coy or reserved and were instead direct and open. She was a very special woman. Of course, Sima Hui had already noticed Gao Jiangwei's leers. Although she felt contempt towards him, she didn't display it outwardly. She made a cupped fist salute towards Captain Gao. "Captain Gao, thank you for escorting me this far. My camp isn't too far from here. I'll have to depend on your guidance in the future as well." "It's no trouble at all. General Sima is a great heroine to us border troops. When the Tu-Hoons attacked us a few days ago, if not for General Sima's timely arrival, our left-wing army would have suffered serious casualties. To demonstrate my appreciation, it would be better for me to escort General Sima all the way." Sima Hui frowned slightly. This time, she didn't refuse his offer and nodded, turning to leave swiftly. Gao Jiangwei shot a look at his two subordinates and followed behind Sima Hui. He glanced sideways at these two subordinates, whose looks could be ranked lower than average, and felt a thread of satisfaction within. Although he didn't look as heroic as Captain Guo nor as scholarly and refined as Zhong Mai, he thought that his looks weren't too bad compared to most of the soldiers in camp, especially when he was dressed in a set of shining armor like he was now, with his hair neatly combed back and his face clean-shaven. With his two subordinates acting as his foils, at least he looked better than that beardy he from the right-wing army. Sima Hui was just an overaged tomboy. She was already in the bag with looks like his. Gao Jiangwei's confidence exploded through the roof, as if Sima Hui was already his. Chapter 321, Barred from Entering Camp, 2. It was dusk, the camp's most chaotic time. As soldiers bustled about around them, Gao Jiangwei kept trying to start up a conversation with Sima Hui. Sima Hui's lips were tightly pressed together, though her face remained calm. She would reply to Captain Gao once in a while. Suddenly, there was a hubbub of noise from somewhere in front. A foot soldier ran by, headed in the direction of the right-wing army's tents. However, due to his urgency, he tripped in front of Sima Hui and Sima Hui quickly reached out to steady him. When the foot soldier saw that the person who had helped him was the newly arrived female general, he looked overwhelmed by her favor. Sima Hui's brows knitted as she asked, "What happened? Why are you in such a rush?" When the foot soldier saw that the female general was questioning him, he didn't dare to hide any details. "General, some men are trying to barge into the camp at the main entrance. This humble one is going to look for Captain Guo." Sima Hui was astonished and she urged the soldier onwards. After thinking for a bit, she started striding towards the main entrance of the camp. Before Jiao Jiangwei had the chance to speak, he saw that Sima Hui had already left. He gritted his teeth and quickly rushed to catch up to her. When they reached the entrance, Sima Hui swept a gaze over the scene before her. A tall man in a black cloak holding a handsome horse in hand was being blocked from entering the camp. He was standing right outside the barricades. His back was to the camp entrance. From behind, his upright posture brought to mind a tall and straight bamboo tree. One of the soldiers nearby recognized the female general and called out a greeting. Perhaps drawn by the shouts behind him, He Changdi turned around. When that handsome face entered Sima Hui's sight, she forgot to breathe for a moment. Her eyes widened and her mind unconsciously sighed. How could there be such a handsome man on earth? His facial features seemed to have been carved by angels. There wasn't a single blemish on his whole face. Jiao Jiangwei was also stunned by the man's looks. When he finally recovered his senses, his first reaction was jealousy. His fists clenched. Where had this man come from? There was absolutely no one like him in the whole entire camp. All those traits that he had thought were the best parts of himself had been instantly beaten by this man. When he noticed that Sima Hui's gaze carried a trace of infatuation as she stared at that man, Jiao Jiangwei was quick to anger. "What are all of you standing around for? Don't you know that the first military law is to kill all who trespass into an army camp?" He Changdi's gaze landed on Jiao Jiangwei and then drifted away just as quickly, as if disgusted by the sight. Before He Changdi could speak, his subordinate's temper had already flared up. "Captain Jiao, don't you dare push us too hard. Our commanding officer is Captain He of the right-wing army. Don't make slanderous accusations without proof." "What? Captain He? That beardy He Changdi? What a joke." If this man was trying to impersonate He Changdi, he should have covered his whole face with a beard first. Jiao Jiangwei didn't believe them at all. He mocked them instead. "What? A pretty boy like this is trying to impersonate Captain He? If he's Captain He, then I'm the great general himself. All right, stop fighting. We'll know whether he's Captain He or not once the men from the right-wing army arrive," Sima Hui suddenly said. Her words carried some weight around here, so the men stopped quarreling. In a moment, the soldier who had run off to the right-wing army returned with Captain Guo, Zhong Mai, and Xiao Hongyu in tow. Captain Guo stared at He Changdi as if he were a ghost. He quickly walked up to him and patted He Changdi's shoulder forcefully. Then he asked, "Are you really Zhixiang?" The corners of He Sanlang's mouth twitched. He lowered his voice and said, "Brother Guo, you have some obscene drawings hidden under your pillow." There was this night when Captain Guo's expression turned stiff. He quickly gripped He Sanlang's shoulder and squeezed. "You brat. Why do you keep acting beyond your years? See, now that you shaved away that beard of yours, no one recognizes you." Xiao Hongyu ran closer and stood in front of He Sanlang, staring right into his eyes. "Wait, what the heck? It's really Brother He. Why did you shave your beard?" Zhong Mai couldn't hold back his laughter as he watched He Changdi's expression getting darker and darker. All right. It was just a misunderstanding. This person really is Captain He. Move along, everybody. It's almost time for dinner." Zhong Mai showed his pass to the soldiers guarding the entrance. The foot soldier held up the pass with reverence and awe as he returned it with both hands. He even rubbed the back of his head sheepishly as he apologized to He Changdi. He Sanlang waved his hand. The soldier was just doing his job. As the band of brothers were about to leave, Sima Hui suddenly called out to them. "Excuse me, Captain He." He Changdi turned slightly and bowed to Sima Hui. He asked in his usual low tone of voice, "Do you have any orders for me, General Sima?" Sima Hui's face was flushed, but it wasn't obvious under the fading light of day. However, her slightly rushed words betrayed how nervous she was. "May I ask if Captain He is the son of the border general at Mingju, Great General He?" He Changdi's brows drew together. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded. Although his identity wasn't well known here at the northern border, he didn't intend to hide it. Captain Guo and the rest knew exactly who he was, so there was nothing he couldn't admit to. I've long admired Great General He. May I ask if uncle and aunt he are doing well? Is the matriarch still sound of health? Sima Hui turned to He Changdi with eyes full of expectation, face slightly flushed with color. He Sanlang's expression didn't budge at all, but his tone turned frosty. General Sima, I haven't returned home in a long time, so I'm not too sure about the situation at home. I have some pressing matters at hand, so please excuse me. After saying so, He Sanlang turned and left. Sima Hui watched in a daze as He Sanlang's figure slowly disappeared into the falling night, her heart full of unvoiced disappointment. Chapter 322, Rumors, 1. Jiao Jiangwei had been standing next to Sima Hui the entire time, his face hidden in the shadows, causing his expression to look a little contorted. His sinister gaze landed on He Changdi's back. His heart was full of dissatisfaction. That handsome young man had really turned out to be that beardy captain He Changdi followed Captain Guo and the rest back to camp. The moment they reached their tent, Xiao Hongyu could no longer hold back his curiosity. He stood right in front of He Changdi and stared dead on at He Changdi's face. Then, he chuckled boorishly and said, Brother He, I finally realized why you like to keep your face covered with that beard. Off to the side, Zhongmai picked up a cup of tea and took a sip with an understanding smile. He Changdi cast a cold glance at Xiao Hongyu. He had zero desire to hear whatever Xiao Hongyu had to say next. Even though our brother He was so cold to her, that lady was still throwing herself into his arms. Brother He, how did you grow to look like that? Aunt He really knows how to make em. Why couldn't my old mom do the same? Captain Guo snorted in laughter. Brat, looking like that, you should be content that your mom even brought you into this world. Xiao Hongyu cried out in anguish and continued staring at He Changdi's face. He Sanlang shot a sideways look at him. What are you staring at me for? To see if I can grow a face like that. Zhongmai smiled. Brat, it's time to stop daydreaming. Xiao Hongyu thumped his chest and stomped his foot. However, after just 2 seconds, his eyes began to shine like a thief's again. Hey! Brother Guo, Brother Zhong, did you see just now? General Sima was looking at Brother He differently. Brother He has got some luck with women. Captain Guo harumphed. He gave a friendly reminder, Zhixiang, I heard that your wife has already settled down in Liangzhu City. He Changdi nodded. It was only then that Xiao Hongyu realized he had put his foot in his mouth again. He shrunk back and tried to make up for his wrongs with flattery. Brother He, I saw sister-in-law with my own 2 eyes back then. Sister-in-law is 100 times prettier than General Sima. Look at how tomboyish that General Sima looks. How could she compare to even a single strand of sister-in-law's hair? Brother He, don't act rashly. Zhongmai slapped Xiao Hongyu's head. Brat, what are you saying all that nonsense for? After eating all that food, when are you going to grow some brains? Great. Xiao Hongyu thought that it was better if he just kept his head down and stopped talking. He was running out of common ground with these 3 loyal wife-loving big brothers. If he had time at night, he could just secretly look at some obscene drawings to scratch his itches. Captain Guo's expression abruptly turned serious as he asked He Changdi, Zhixiang, did you find anything in your investigations today? Even though it was close to midnight, the lights in Sima Hui's tent were still on. Under the flickering of candlelight, Sima Hui's handsome face looked softer and more like a woman's. She was frowning. Her expression didn't look too good. What did you say? He Sanlang is already married? The female adjutant next to her nodded. She was lamenting the fact inwardly as well. He Changdi had been born into a military official family. His father was also a border general that her young miss admired greatly. She had heard that the He family was upright and that the men would only take concubines if they didn't have any heirs by the time they turned 30. Her young miss's marriage had been delayed due to old General Sima's passing. Now she was already 20, and she happened to be the same age as He Sanlang. If He Sanlang wasn't married, he would indeed be the best candidate for her young miss hand. He Sanlang married before he came and joined the army. The He family's third young madam is House Ying's sixth miss. Why did the He family take a bride from House Ying? Although Sima Hui hadn't returned to the capital for a long time, she still had some understanding of the complicated relations between the nobles in the capital. If not for old Duke Ying still holding up House Ying, it would probably have fallen to a third-rate noble house. Going by common sense, a noble house in imperial favor like the He family wouldn't choose to marry a bride from House Ying. Chapter 323, Rumors, 2. The female adjutant explained all the details behind the He family's situation. Sima Hui shook her head helplessly. Although she had taken a liking to He Changdi, since he had already taken a wife, she wasn't going to break up his marriage. She had her own pride and dignity. She could only lament that she hadn't met He Changdi earlier. The female adjutant had been serving Sima Hui since they were children and was her close confidant and handmaid. She had been raised in old General Sima's estate like an adopted daughter at a young age and had accompanied Sima Hui all this while. She was extremely loyal to old General Sima, as well as Sima Hui. When old General Sima had died in battle, the female adjutant treated Sima Hui as her only remaining master. She carefully asked, "Miss, do you like He Sanlang?" Sima Hui was normally a very direct woman. Furthermore, there was nothing she couldn't say in front of a handmaid who had grown up with her like a sister. Thus, she admitted her liking for He Sanlang. The female adjutant's eyes darted about in thought. Sima Hui had followed old General Sima to the army ever since she could walk. In old General Sima's estate, she had been raised like a son. When it came to relationships, she wasn't very reserved, but she had never admitted to liking a man so readily before. Ever since old General Sima had passed away, the female adjutant had worried her little heart away for her young miss marriage. Now that she heard that Sima Hui had a man she liked, she racked her brains in thought. "Miss, this servant heard that He Sanlang's wife hasn't gotten pregnant yet." Sima Hui nodded and replied a little absent-mindedly. She was feeling down, so she didn't think before she said, "They've just gotten married. How would she get pregnant so fast? However, they'll surely have a child sooner or later." The female adjutant seemed to disagree with Sima Hui's reply. "Miss, you might not know this, but House Ying's sixth miss was only able to marry He Sanlang because of that reputation the ladies of House Ying have. Matriarch He must have been at her wit's end to try a method like that. If this servant's guess is correct, He Sanlang must have come to the northern border just a few days after getting married. He Sanlang probably isn't too happy with that newlywed wife of his." Sima Hui's brows furrowed. "Xiaoyan, you're not allowed to gossip about others like that. We've never met any of the He family before. Those are just wild guesses." After getting a warning from Sima Hui, the female adjutant, Xiaoyan, immediately pressed her lips together and bowed her head in apology. "It's this servant's fault for making wild guesses about others. This servant will accept any punishment, miss." Sima Hui couldn't bear to see her like this, so she took Xiaoyan's hands into hers and reassured her. "All right, Xiaoyan. I know you're just trying to help me, but I've already missed out on my chance. Unless we get reborn again, it's just not possible between He Sanlang and I. It's getting late, so why don't you return to your tent and rest early? Let Xiaoya take the night shift tonight." The female adjutant could only agree with her master. She helped Sima Hui prepare for bed before leaving the tent. Xiaoyan stood in the shadows by the tent for a long while. Her eyes shone with a bright light as she stared up at the dark sky. "My good young miss. You still don't understand. You have to fight for what you want. If you don't fight for it, you'll only end up with the same fate as the old general. However, as long as she, Xiaoyan, was around, her miss wouldn't need to fight. She would naturally prepare everything for her young miss." On the fifth day that Chu Lian had settled into the He estate at Liangju City, a second wave of snow started falling. The snowstorm continued for 3 days and grew even larger as time passed, covering the whole of Liangju City in a blanket of white. Chapter 324, Rumors, 3. From afar, it looked as if the endless grasslands had melded into one. Tang Yang and Chu Lian were at a loss of what to do. They heard that it had also started snowing over at Tianjiang Harbor. If the snows continued like this, in just 2 days, the roads that led to Liangju, whether on land or by water, would be completely covered in ice and snow. By then, Liangju City would become an isolated city. Without any supplies, the two Huns probably didn't even need to fight them. Given 3 months, the northern border troops would simply starve to death without any external interference. Tang Yang had already sent some men out to Sioux City to check out the situation. They could no longer use the route traveling through the Yuqin Mountains, either. The snowstorm had already cut off all paths. Neither the supplies nor the reinforcements could pass. By the last day of November, Chu Lian's injury was already mostly healed over. With the accompaniment of Tang Yang and the rest, she brought a small portion of supplies from the capital over to the northern border camp. She had already agreed on the time with He Sanlang, so Chu Lian set out early in the morning in her carriage. Chu Lian wasn't going to the front lines. She was just going to the camp of the reserve forces, so there wasn't any danger. When she reached the camp before 11 a.m., it was still snowing. Thanks to the Empress Dowager's decree that Chu Lian had in her hands, it was Great General Qian himself who would receive her. Since most of the soldiers in camp were all rough men, Great General Qian had specially borrowed a team of female soldiers from Sima Hui to welcome Chu Lian. The northern border was currently in the middle of an extremely cold winter. As Chu Lian was helped off the carriage by Wenlan, she was completely wrapped up like a round ball. She wore a large grey squirrel fur coat, the fluffy fur-lined sleeves of which nearly enveloped the entirety of her hands. She was also holding a hand warmer for additional protection. More than half of her face was covered up by her hood, so that only her wide almond-shaped eyes could be seen. Since her leg had just healed recently, she walked much slower than most people and her awkward gait looked a little amusing. When Sima Hui's female adjutant, Xiaoyan, finally met with the He family's third young madam, she had to suppress her snort of laughter. Her heart was filled with disdain. How clumsy-looking. No wonder the handsome He Sanlang didn't like her. She heard that this third young madam had even been given the title of honored lady. Xiaoyan wondered which noble she had begged for that title, all in hopes of giving herself a little more status. The He family's matriarch had really racked her brains out to help this sixth miss. The female adjutant shot a look at the handmaids nearby, dressed in battle attire like she was. The leader of the handmaids nodded and quickly followed Chu Lian's small party. When they entered the camp, the first one to welcome them was Captain Guo. With Tang Yang by her side to introduce her, Chu Lian bobbed slightly in greeting to Captain Guo. Captain Guo cast a measuring gaze over Chu Lian before chuckling. Zhixiang should have been the one to welcome you today, but he went to the front lines yesterday, so has not in camp right now. Thus, the duty of welcoming you has fallen on this old brother's shoulders. IHPOE you can understand the circumstances, Sir Tang, sister-in-law. Chu Lian shook her head and smiled. Brother Guo, there's no need to stand on ceremony like this. It's the first time my husband has joined the army, we'll have to rely on Brother Guo's care in the days ahead. After saying so, she signaled for Wenlan to offer a blue pouch up to Captain Guo. These are just some small snacks, I hope Brother Guo will accept this small token of my gratitude. Captain Guo had taken a liking to this bright-eyed and generous newly met sister-in-law of his. He took Chu Lian's gift respectfully with both hands and accepted the gift with a smile. Sir Tang, honored lady, please rest in these 2 tents for a moment. I'll go ahead and report your arrival to the general. Tang Yang bowed to Captain Guo. Sorry for the trouble, Captain Guo. Chu Lian was led into the tent on the left by the female soldiers. Since Tang Yang was a man, he was led to the tent on the other side. Chapter 325, Rumors, 4. Thick furs were laid down on the floor of the tent, and there was a charcoal brazier burning within. It was much warmer in here than outside. Although the decor was rather simple, each of the items were still of high quality. There was a screen painted with pictures of Chinese plum blossoms and orchids in the center of the tent. Behind was a simple, narrow bed. There were 2 sets of white clothes placed on the table beside it, as well as a pair of deerskin boots on the carpet nearby. Although the boots were made of steel and leather, judging by their size, Chu Lian surmised that they were probably worn by a woman. Chu Lian's expression changed slightly. This was most likely the tent of General Sima, the female general that the book had mentioned only in passing. She looked around her surroundings curiously. This was the first time she had seen a female general's tent. However, it wasn't much different from normal tents, apart from the slightly higher quality items and warmer decor. While looking at the tent, she thought of Changdi and wondered what his tent looked like. Chu Lian decided to ask Captain Guo to take her to Changdi's tent to have a peek after she was done with official business. For some reason, once she decided on that, there was a secret trace of delight in her heart. Wenqing and Wenlan weren't as relaxed as Chu Lian was. They were also looking around the tent like Chu Lian was. Wenqing helped her master out of the large squirrel fur coat and set it down on a wooden chair nearby. She then took the hand warmer from Chu Lian and refilled the charcoal within. While Wenqing was doing all this, she had the strange feeling that the women behind them dressed in battle attire were staring at her master with hostility. Wenlan couldn't hold back her unease. She carefully poked her older sister in the side and used her eyes to ask Wenqing, why were there so many women in the army camp? Wenqing shook her head at her and looked pointedly at her hands, instructing her to keep her focus on serving third young madam. Xiaoyan was standing to the side. Her figure was similar to Sima Hui's, and they were both tall women. However, she was the skinnier of the two. Due to the long years of training in the army, she had an imposing air that most normal women didn't have. As she stood at the side and looked down at the weak woman seated next to her, even though her tone was calm, there was still a hint of contempt and arrogance in her words. This subordinate greets honored Lady Jeannie on the general's behalf. Honored lady must know that our general has already led most of the right-wing army to the front lines yesterday and that captain he was also amongst them. Thus, this subordinate takes the place of our general to welcome honored lady. This subordinate hopes that honored Lady Jeannie doesn't take offense. After Xiaoyan finished speaking, she took a cup of tea from one of the handmaids next to her and offered it to Chu Lian by placing it on the side table with both hands. When Wenqing heard this female adjutant's words, her brows furrowed and she turned to her master with worry. Chu Lian shifted her gaze from her surroundings and looked up at the adjutant who had just spoken. She blinked and smiled before replying courteously, General Sima is too kind. Xiaoyan kept her eyes on the face of the He family's third young madam, which still held the traces of her tender youth. Upon hearing her calm reply, Xiaoyan didn't know how to react. What was she trying to pull here? Couldn't she tell that the expressions of her two maidservants had already turned stormy? The adjutant lost a little of her composure. She could only do her best to try and smile as she said, it's fine as long as honored lady doesn't blame this subordinate. Chu Lian smiled as well and took the refilled hand warmer from Wenqing's hands. She turned to Wenlan and said lightly, I'm a little thirsty. Wenlan quickly took out a small copper pot wrapped in cloth from the little bag that she always carried around. She took out a porcelain cup as well and poured out a steaming hot cup of honey water for Chu Lian. Xiaoyan looked at the actions of the master and servant before her, her eyes filled with disdain. As she had lived in the Sima estate ever since she was a child, she had grown up around all sorts of luxury items and foods naturally. She could tell that this honey water wasn't just any normal honey water. But who cared about the quality? In the end, only poor country bumpkins favored honey water over sencha. This honored Lady Jeannie couldn't even recognize high-quality sencha when it was right under her nose. Xiaoyan couldn't resist remarking, honored lady might not know this, but this subordinate just offered some Zhongshan tea to honored lady. This tea is what our general usually drinks. Chapter 326, Rumors, 5. What General Sima normally drinks. The quality of Zhongshan tea was only slightly lower than that of the imperial tribute teas. The amount of Zhongshan tea produced was even less than that of the North Fujian looseleaf tea. Every year, before it was time for the spring harvest of tea, the nobles would fill up all the reservations for Zhongshan tea cakes. It wasn't something that could be bought with money alone. Back then, Miss Yuan had tried to use some Zhongshan tea stolen from her grandfather to provoke Chu Lian. Chu Lian looked at the adjutant and almost burst out laughing. Were General Sima's thoughts the same as this adjutant's, or was it just this female adjutant who was stupid? Chu Lian had thought about declining the tea outright, but instead, She chose a more subtle route and hoped the female adjutant would get the message. Honestly, this kind of ploy was just too clumsy and silly. She had also seen it done before by Miss Yuan. However, before Chu Lian could speak, Wenlan could no longer hold back her desire to protect her master. "Excuse me, madam. You might not know this, but our master doesn't like to drink sencha because it tastes weird." After getting such a reply, the female adjutant's face flushed red and her lips started trembling. Chu Lian turned to look at Wenlan disapprovingly. Wenlan stopped talking. The female adjutant's disrespect had been written all over her face. Chu Lian didn't intend on admonishing her own maidservants in front of strangers. She turned back around, keeping her face warm and friendly as she kept her silence. After some time, the female adjutant finally got over the dissatisfaction in her heart. She took in a deep breath and forced a smile. It was this subordinate's fault for not checking about honored Lady Chu's likes in advance. Chu Lian replied with a courteous, "It's fine." The adjutant Xiaoyan wanted to continue saying something else, but before she could, a soldier announced from outside the tent that Great General Qian had sent an escort for honored Lady Jeannie, and they were to head to the commander's tent immediately. Chu Lian stood up and led her party out of the warm tent. Xiaoyan sent them off at the entrance. As she stared at Chu Lian's disappearing back, the smile on her face finally faded away and her long face contorted. The handmaid next to her complained in a low voice, that honored Lady Jeannie can't even tell good from bad. She even dislikes sencha. This servant thinks that she probably hasn't ever had sencha before and just doesn't dare to admit it. Xiaoyan's lips curved up in a mocking smile. That was probably the case. She was just a poor noble from a declining house. How could she possibly compare to their female general? The female adjutant Xiaoyan hadn't lied on one point. Sima Hui did drink sencha often. Her favorite was Zhengshan tea. Although she wasn't part of the main branch of the Sima family, she had old General Sima's connections. While the current Sima family had become rather short of male heirs, they still lived in luxury and had much better lives than most of the second-rate noble families in the capital. Otherwise, the handmaid Xiaoyan, who had been raised like an adopted daughter, wouldn't have become so arrogant. Xiaoyan sneered. "Make sure you follow the orders I gave you last night." "Yes, Sister Xiaoyan. This servant will go and make the preparations now." General Qian personally escorted Chu Lian out of the commander's tent. With the war at hand, he didn't have much time to accompany Tang Yang and Chu Lian's party. He had taken time to meet them personally out of respect for the Empress Dowager's decree and the supplies they had brought. Due to the relationship between Captain Guo and He Changdi, once Chu Lian left the commander's tent, General Qian handed them over to Captain Guo. It was already past 1 p.m. by now. Since it was Chu Lian's first time in the army camp and He Sanlang wasn't around, Captain Guo took the initiative to invite Chu Lian, Tang Yang, and the rest to stay for lunch. Captain Guo smiled and said, "Sister-in-law, although the meals in our camp are just some simple fare, it might be an interesting experience for you, just once in your life." Chu Lian didn't reject him. Since she had already come over to the border camp, she wanted to take a good look around. A chance like this didn't come along every day. Tang Yang's thoughts were along the same line as Chu Lian's. However, the only difference was that he was a man, so it was much more convenient for him to move around in the army camp. In recent years, he had been working for Prince Jin, so he hadn't left the capital in quite a few years. He wanted to take this chance to observe how things were structured in the army, as well as their daily training and other general affairs. Chapter 327, Rumors, 6. Tang Yang wanted to take a look at the training grounds, so he bid farewell to Captain Guo and Chu Lian before leaving with another officer. Although Chu Lian wanted to look at the training grounds too, the grounds were likely filled with strong, young men, so it wasn't appropriate for her to watch them. She could only follow Captain Guo to the campgrounds of the right-wing army and see exactly what kind of environment He Sanlang lived in. More than half of the right-wing army had gone to the front lines to act as reinforcements, so there were only little more than half of the men left here. Most of the men remaining had gone to the training grounds, so there were even fewer people milling about. However, it was more convenient for Chu Lian that way. Captain Guo did have some business at hand and he was the only officer left in the right-wing army now, so he had to do everything himself. Once their party reached the campgrounds, a soldier rushed over to report that one of the squad leaders had twisted his leg on the training grounds, and had even started fighting with another squad leader from the left-wing army. Captain Guo's expression turned icy. When Chu Lian noticed that Captain Guo seemed put on the spot, she said, "Brother Guo, if you have something urgent to settle, please feel free to go ahead. I just need someone else to bring me around." Captain Guo hesitated for 2 seconds, but there was nothing else he could do. "Then please sit in Zixiang's tent for a while, sister-in-law. Once I've settled my business, I'll come back immediately and accompany sister-in-law for the midday meal." Captain Guo instructed his adjutant to lead Chu Lian over to He Sanlang's tent before he left with the soldier who had given the report. Wenqing watched as Captain Guo's back disappeared into the distance. For some reason, she felt that the chain of events had been too much of a coincidence. However, she couldn't say anything with strangers present. Wenqing could only helplessly worry and keep an eye on her carefree master. Captain Guo's adjutant was a slightly short and plump young man with a squarish face. When he smiled, his eyes would pinch up and become 2 tiny, upturned smiles of their own. He looked like someone who was very easy to get along with. This adjutant took the lead and pointed at the right side of the camp. "Honored lady, please follow this subordinate this way. Captain He's tent is in the second to last row." Chu Lian nodded and allowed Wenlan to support her as they walked. Her leg hadn't recovered completely yet, so she was a little slow while walking. The adjutant specially slowed down to accommodate her. Little flakes of snow were drifting in the sky, so Wenlan put a warm hat on Chu Lian's head. He Sanlang's tent wasn't too far, but due to Chu Lian's snail-like pace, they used more than twice the normal amount of time it might take. Once they reached the tent that the adjutant had mentioned, it didn't look too different from any of the other tents around except for the 2 female soldiers standing in front of the tent. Chu Lian paused in her steps and her almond-shaped eyes narrowed. The hands she had stuffed into her rabbit fur sleeve clenched unconsciously. The adjutant's eyes widened in shock. He rubbed the back of his head as he tried to think of an explanation. In the entire army, no one but General Sima had command of the female soldiers. So, why were General Sima's female soldiers standing in front of Captain He's tent? In front of the tent, there was a wooden basin filled with water and a few shirts. It clearly announced for all to see what the female soldiers were doing for He Changdi. As for who could have given orders to the prideful female soldiers, there was only one possible culprit. When had that He Sanlang gotten such good treatment? The adjutant was a little jealous. However, when he turned to look at the pretty little honored lady genie next to him, his expression changed. As he thought of the terrible situation that the poor He Sanlang was about to be embroiled in, he felt that he would rather be an old bachelor who washed his own clothes by himself. Chapter 328, Rumors, 7. As Xiaoyan stood behind Chu Lian obediently, the corner of her mouth curled up. Wenlan's eyes widened. She bit her lip as she tried to control her anger. The atmosphere turned awkward in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, Chu Lian smiled. In a carefree manner, she said, "What are you standing around all dazed for? Let's go." The adjutant quickly added, "Yes, let's go. It's cold outside, and it looks like it's about to start snowing hard. We should return to the tents to warm up." As if they hadn't noticed the party over there at all, the female soldiers in front of the tent continued busying themselves with their chores. While washing the clothes, they even happily chatted amongst each other, occasionally bursting into peals of laughter. The male adjutant's rank wasn't very high. These female soldiers were also General Sima's subordinates. Even if they bumped into each other on normal days, both the left wing and the right wing would have to give way to them. He didn't have any authority to chase those female soldiers away. Since honored Lady Jeannie hadn't said anything, he couldn't do anything about the female soldiers now, either. The adjutant glanced at the female soldiers from time to time before looking at Chu Lian. His expression turned more and more pained. He had thought that this would be an easy task. Who could have known that something like this would happen? He had to ask for some extra compensation from Captain He later. As the party drew closer to the tent, they could hear every word of the female soldiers' conversation. Wenqing's expression turned cold. She was about to go up and reprimand them, but Chu Lian held her back with one raised hand. Our general treats Captain He really well. Isn't that so? Captain He risked his life to save our general the last time they were on the front lines. It's only right that our general treats him well. And I couldn't tell before, but Captain He is so skilled. If you ask me, Captain He and our general are the most perfect match for each other. They were both born in military families. Our general can even assist Captain He in the future. But I heard Captain He is already married? Captain His current wife is just some poor noble. How could she compare to our general? That's true. Our general and Captain He are getting along so well. When our general left for the front lines yesterday, Captain He followed along because he couldn't stop worrying. When the war in the north ends, we might even be able to attend our general's wedding banquet. Stop daydreaming and hurry up. We have to finish washing these clothes or the general will punish us when she returns. Chu Lian's brows drew together in a slight frown. It was only after she had finished listening to their conversation that she started walking again and continued heading towards the tent. She sneered in her heart. Who could have thought that her lunatic husband was so attractive to others? Even General Sima had taken a liking to him. Chu Lian cast a sideways glance at the female adjutant slowly following behind them. It wasn't until they had gotten close enough to see the two female soldiers in front of the tent that the female adjutant seemed to finally realize that they were part of her general's troops. She hurriedly rushed forward to reprimand them. What are you doing here? Why aren't you at training? You know very well what our rules say, so why haven't you admitted your wrongs yet? The two female soldiers knelt on the ground and trembled after getting scolded by the female adjutant. This servant is in the wrong, Sister Xiaoyan, we are willing to bear the penalty. Go back to our camp now. It'll be 10 smacks of the rod for each of you, Xiaoyan coldly ordered. The female soldiers acknowledged the orders while trembling. However, they continued kneeling on the ground and refused to get up. Xiaoyan's face turned even more grave. Why are you still here? The female soldiers exchanged looks before finally gathering up the courage to speak and said, this servant has committed a wrong and is willing to receive punishment, but Captain his clothes haven't been washed clean yet. If General finds out, we'll be punished even more. Chu Lian blinked as she watched from the side. Had these ladies gotten addicted to acting? Chapter 329, Rumors, 8. Although Xiaoyan's expression seemed angry on the surface, there was a glint of delight in her eyes. She was clearly happy with the performance that the female soldiers had put on. Just as she was about to finish up the whole act, Chu Lian suddenly spoke up. What they said is right. There must always be a start and an end to things. Since you're here to help my husband wash his clothes under the orders of General Sima, then you should finish washing them before you leave. Xiaoyan had been expecting Chu Lian to stomp her foot in a tantrum. She hadn't expected Chu Lian to calmly order her subordinates to continue instead. Xiaoyan parted her mouth to retort, but she realized that she couldn't find a reason to reject that order. It was like trying to eat a peach. The peach looked fresh, juicy, and fragrant, but in her haste to eat it, she realized that she had bitten off more than she could chew and was about to choke herself. The two female soldiers were also clearly shocked. They gaped in silence as they lost their composure. Seeing how the two soldiers hadn't moved, Chu Lian turned to the female adjutant and frowned. The female adjutant's heart thumped. She could only grit her teeth and order her trusted subordinates to continue washing the clothes. It was only after finishing that they would return to their camp to get punished. The two female soldiers could only lower their heads and continue washing the clothes. However, their moods were markedly different from earlier. The hot washing water had already cooled down. They were standing at the entrance of the tent, so cold winds were blowing little flakes of snow at them. When they soaked their hands in the icy water, they ached from the cold. However, even so, they could only grit their teeth and bear with it for now. Chu Lian entered He Changdi's tent without a second look back at the female soldiers. The expression of Captain Guo's adjutant hadn't changed during the whole event, staying shocked and dazed. Now that it was over, he scratched the back of his head and beamed with a silly smile. Although Honored Lady had only said a single line during that whole scene, Why did it feel like all his frustrations had been vented for him? Their right-wing army normally also suffered from the bullying of these tyrant flowers. It wasn't until Chu Lian and her party had entered the tent that the two female soldiers dared to lift their heads up. One of them called out in an aggrieved voice, "Sister Xiaoyan, this water is so cold." The female adjutant gritted her molars and glared at the closed tent flap. She squatted down and reassured them. "Sorry I've gotten you involved in this mess. I'll wash these together with you so we can finish up faster. That way you can return to camp earlier to rest." The female soldier who had spoken up made a feeble sound of agreement, and the three women started washing the clothes together. The aggrieved female soldier was Xiaoyon's very own little sister. Xiaoyan normally spoiled her, and her little sister had never suffered much at all. Xiaoyan usually kept her well protected under her wings, so she couldn't bear to see her little sister suffer even the tiniest bit of grievance. There actually weren't many clothes in the basin, just 3 pieces in total. They each took one and managed to finish washing them quickly. Even though the washing water was ice cold, it was still bearable for that short moment. Just as the 3 of them had finished washing the clothes and were about to pour away the water, the tent flap suddenly opened from the inside and Wenlan tossed a whole bunch of clothes into the wooden basin. "These are all the dirty clothes that honored lady found in the tent. I'm guessing that you must have missed them earlier. Why don't you just wash them all together?" After Wenlan finished speaking, she turned around and entered the tent again, leaving behind 3 dazed women. One of the female soldiers looked at the small pile of clothes that the wooden basin was struggling to contain. Her lip trembled as she caught sight of a thick and heavy cloak in the basin. How were they going to wash such a heavy cloak? The female soldier was on the verge of tears. "Sister Xiaoyan, let's not wash these anymore. Let's go back." They had been the ones to claim that they were washing the clothes under General Sima's orders in the first place. How could they disobey their orders at this point? Xiaoyan knew that honored Lady Genie was showing them that she wasn't to be bullied. However, she didn't have anything to counter the honored lady. Helpless, she could only do her best to finish the task that had been so unceremoniously dropped on them. "Stop talking. Save your strength for washing." Chapter 330, Naughty Book 1. The moment Wenlan let the tent flap fall, she couldn't resist any longer and let out a snort of laughter. Wenqing glared at her. Wenlan ran up to Chu Lian and whispered, "Third young madam, that felt so good." Wenqing was also proud of her master. She knew that her master wasn't someone who would allow others to bully her. If someone provoked her, Chu Lian would always return an eye for an eye. If she didn't, then that meant she didn't care about the insult and would let it slide. Chu Lian was the type of person who kept her frustrations inside her. Her expression wouldn't change even as her annoyance grew. Taking retribution was a way of venting her anger. If there wasn't any anger, then naturally, there wouldn't be any reason to vent. When Chu Lian saw how happy Wenlan was, she replied a little helplessly, "They're just little girls. Let them go back once they're done washing everything." After hearing Chu Lian's words, Wenqing and Wenlan calmed down, although their worry still showed on their faces. Wenqing thought for a bit before saying, "Third young madam, don't think too much of it. Third young master isn't that sort of person. That was just some groundless gossip." Chu Lian turned around to smile at Wenqing, her almond-shaped eyes turning into upturned crescents. Under the heat of that stare, Wenqing felt a little awkward. She quickly explained, "Third young madam, this servant isn't trying to speak for third young master." Okay, I'm not blaming you." Chu Lian didn't express any of her thoughts on the relationship between He Changdi and General Sima. In her view, things weren't certain yet. All they had heard were a few rumors, which couldn't be considered substantial evidence that there was something going on between the two. Furthermore, even if He Sanlang and General Sima had some sort of dalliance, she could discuss things with He Sanlang and find a way to allow General Sima to take her place. As long as she remained an honored lady, she could live happily by herself. She would even be free of those troublesome social engagements back in the capital. Wouldn't that be a win-win situation? She could find a man she liked and settle into a peaceful, happy life. He Sanlang, who was fighting for his life on the front lines, had no idea that his wicked wife was thinking about how to get away from him. They hadn't even consummated their marriage yet and she was already considering divorce. If He Sanlang ever found out, it was highly possible he'd puke blood. Wenqing and Wenlan had been serving Chu Lian for a while now, and they understood a little of her personality. They knew that third young madam didn't want to discuss General Sima's matters anymore, so they all kept quiet. A soldier from outside sent in a brazier. Wenqing shifted it closer to keep Chu Lian warm. He Sanlang's tent couldn't be compared to General Sima's. The tent wasn't very big. Inside, there were only 2 narrow beds with a simple screen dividing the space in 2. There were no carpets placed on the floor, either. It was just some black dirt stripped bare of its surface layer of turf. Snow had been falling for quite a few days here, so the tent entrance was already a muddy mess. Thanks to the low temperatures, the mud had frozen over. The tent felt extremely moist and wasn't very comfortable. There wasn't much inside besides that, other than a small table next to the bed on the left. A few tactic books were stacked in a neat pile on top alongside a basic set of ink, brush, and paper. There was also a wooden box placed beside both beds, most likely for the soldiers to store their clothes and other items. Chu Lian knew that He Sanlang wasn't staying in this tent alone, but was sharing with Xiao Hongyu. Of these 2 beds, only one was He Sanlang's. Wenqing and Wenlan were also taking in the arrangements. Of the 2, Wenlan was the first to speak. Her cheeks puffed up as she said, "That General Sima's living arrangements are so nice. How is it that our third young masters are so terrible in comparison?" This tent was cold and dark. Without a charcoal brazier burning, it would be practically inhospitable. Chapter 331, Naughty Book, 2. Chu Lian smiled without answering. He Changdi's status was different from Sima Hui's, after all. He had just entered the army and was a man. Furthermore, Great General Qian was known for being strict with his troops. He Changdi was already pretty lucky to get a 2-man tent like this, and in such a short period of time, too. Otherwise, he would have had to squeeze into the barracks. Chu Lian was right. If not for how she had helped old Duke Zheng, and had old Duke Zheng not sent the letter to Great General Qian, He Changdi wouldn't have been able to rise in the ranks so quickly, nor would he be getting this sort of treatment. Wenqing pointed at the bed that was further in. "Third young madam, that one should be third young master's bed. Look, there's the fleece mattress we brought from our estate. Why don't you sit there?" Chu Lian walked up to the bed and pulled her hand from her sleeve. She gently touched the slightly flattened, worn mattress before holding her hand up to her nose and taking a sniff. Then, she shook her head and sat on the other bed instead. "This one is husband's bed." "Ah!" Wenqing found it strange, so she looked at the 2 beds again. She didn't understand how third young madam had been able to differentiate them. The mattress on the other bed was clearly from the Jingan estate though. Without waiting for Wenqing to ask, Chu Lian began to explain. "Look at the boots next to the bed. He Changdi was tall and his legs were long. Of course his feet were bigger. Xiao Hongyu was shorter, so his feet tended towards a smaller size. Furthermore, Chu Lian had been the one to send this pair of boots to He Changdi. She had changed them a little, adding a layer of leather on the inside of the boots. The insides wouldn't get wet even when it rained. She had also made a small decorative mark on an unassuming corner of the boots that only the maidservants of Songtao Court would recognize. Fleece bedding and blankets could be given away, but everyone's shoes were differently sized. He Changdi and Xiao Hongyu's feet were so different that they couldn't possibly share their socks and boots. Wenqing and Wenlan looked down at the very different boots. Both of them understood. They looked up at Chu Lian with shining eyes. Wenlan couldn't hold back the smirk tugging up the corners of her lips. Who would dare to cast doubts on third young master and third young madam's relationship now? Third young madam had discerned third young master's bed at one glance. Chu Lian had only given them a very simple reason. Actually, she hadn't used the shoes to determine which of the beds was He Changdis. He Sanlang was rather fussy, even bordering a little on the obsessive-compulsive side. He was also a clean freak, although it wasn't too serious. She had discovered this the last time he had taken a shower at Liangzhou's He estate. The first time she saw him enter, He Sanlang had been covered in dirt. His expression had been ugly as well, clearly hating his state of uncleanliness. Later on, he had taken a whole hour to bathe. When Wenqing had gone to clean up the dirty clothes in the bathroom, she had discovered that He Sanlang had actually folded up all the dirty clothes and placed them neatly on the side table next to the bathtub. The soap bar had also been covered back up, and the towel had been folded up right next to the soap box. The corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched as she glanced down at He Changdis' bed. Although it was simple, the blankets on it had been neatly made. The pillow was placed right at the head of the bed, and not a single wrinkle could be seen on the blankets. As for the other bed, although it couldn't be considered messy, it was a whole different story when compared to He Changdis. There was one more point that Chu Lian was too embarrassed to reveal. Although He Changdi was a man, he always carried a clean, nice-smelling scent. Meanwhile, that fleece blanket had stunk of sweat. If Xiao Hongyu were to find out that he had been slighted by sister-in-law in this way, he would have definitely rolled around on the floor like a child, demanding snacks to recover from this mental blow. Chapter 332, Naughty Book 3. Chu Lian pressed down on the mattress with her small hands. The thin mattress was practically stuck to the bedboard. She flipped it over to check the insides of it and discovered that it was not made of cotton or fur, but dried grass. Chu Lian's brows gathered together in a frown. Such a thin mattress wouldn't be able to keep the body warm at all. If it was spring or autumn, it might still be alright to make do with this mattress, but in this bone-piercingly cold winter. She remembered that she had specially ordered the servants to send bedding to He Changdi when she was back in the estate. Her gaze landed on Xiao Hongyu's bed. That thick fleece bedding that should have been He Changdi's had somehow been placed on someone else's bed. Chu Lian wasn't so silly as to think that He Changdi had been bullied in the camp. The short and plump Xiao Hongyu had been amongst the rescue party that had come for them back then too. She wondered if Xiao Hongyu had any sort of internal injury that caused him to be more susceptible to the cold. That seemed like a possible explanation for why He Sanlang had given him his own bedding. Chu Lian rolled her eyes. That lunatic husband of hers had only ever showed her cold expressions, yet he was extremely kind to others. However, that fellow was rather stupid. After giving away all his things to others, what was he going to use to cover himself? Didn't he know how to buy another for himself? Chu Lian felt a momentary lapse of disappointment at He Sanlang. She stood up and wrapped her grey squirrel cloak around her as the cold air turned her sigh into a white puff of breath. She then turned to Wenqing and Wenlan to give them orders. Have someone bring the big rugs and blankets from my carriage here. Bring some needles and thread too. Wenlan blinked as she processed the order. In a quick moment, she understood what Chu Lian was going to do, so she hurriedly ran off to execute the order. Wenlan was a practiced martial artist, so she was pretty fast on her feet. In 15 minutes, she had brought everything over. Chu Lian took off her cloak and moved the blanket on He Changdi's bed aside before pulling up the thin bedsheet. There was only dried grass under the sheet, although the grass was laid out quite evenly. Chu Lian was about to move the dried grass away, when she noticed a flash of blue hidden within them. She walked over to it curiously and brushed the grass aside, revealing an indigo purse lying flat on the bed. Chu Lian pulled out the purse from where it had been stuck between a gap in the layers of dried grass. When she shook it out in front of herself, Wenqing spotted the purse and spoke up. Isn't that the purse that you use to keep your snacks, third young madam? All of Chu Lian's snack purses had been made by the maidservants in Songtao Court, and most of them were plain in color without much embroidery on them. Wenqing and Wenlan had made quite a few of them too, so they could recognize it with just one glance. Chu Lian had recognized it as well. The purse was bulging slightly, but it wasn't heavy. The jerky and snacks that had originally been placed inside were already gone. She undid the ties on the purse and realized that there was a stack of similar purses placed neatly within. When Chu Lian finished eating all the snacks in a purse, she would normally throw the purse away, since they were just some crude bags like the plastic bags of the modern era. However, He Sanlang had actually kept every single one of them. A strange and indescribable feeling sparked to life within Chu Lian's heart. She tied up the purse again and put it back where she had found it. Just as she was about to stand, she noticed a blue leather book slotted between a gap in the planks of the wooden bed. In a moment of curiosity, she bent down and took the book out. The cover of the book was made of blue leather and it was a very thin book. It looked like there were 20 or so pages in it at most, yet there was nothing written on the cover. Chu Lian found it strange, so she carefully flipped the book open. It was only when she looked at the first page that Chu Lian finally found some words, Pleasures of the World. Chu Lian frowned. That seemed to be the title of this book. Why was it so weird though? There wasn't any author's name written in the book either. When she flipped to the next page, Chu Lian finally realized why this book didn't have a title on the cover nor any author. The page she had flipped to was a crude picture of a half-dressed couple. They were locked in a passionate embrace while lying on a bed next to a half-opened window. Chu Lian almost puked up some blood. He Sanlang actually read naughty books. It was such a crudely made one too. After she recovered from her shock, she continued flipping through the book with a calm expression. It was just 20 or so pages, so she quickly finished looking through the book. There wasn't actually much of note inside. The people and scenes inside were just too cartoonish and unrealistic. Some of them were even contorted into such weird positions that their heads and bodies seemed disconnected. Why was He Sanlang hiding a book as lousy as this like it was some kind of treasure? If she randomly picked out a porn book from the modern era and gave it to He Sanlang, wouldn't he dig out a secret vault to hide it then? Her lunatic husband was way too inexperienced. Chapter 333, Naughty Book, 4. Chu Lian casually tossed the obscene drawings aside and continued cleaning out the dry grasses on the bed. Wenqing and Wenlan had curious expressions on as they asked, "Third young madam, what kind of book is that?" Chu Lian cast a sideways glance at the book and spoke in an indifferent tone. "See for yourselves." Wenlan was the more active of the pair. Her curiosity was already burning like an itch in her heart. Third young madam had looked through that book for quite some time just now. She had even been holding back her laughter while reading. That just made her even more curious. She glanced at her older sister before taking the book in hand. Wenqing also drew closer to her. However, after flipping the first 2 pages, the 2 girls screamed and the book dropped to the ground. Chu Lian found their actions weird, so she asked, "What's wrong?" Wenqing and Wenlan's faces were completely flushed. They stared at Chu Lian with eyes of rebuke. "Third young madam, those are lewd drawings." Chu Lian almost tilted her head in confusion. "I know that. How are you so calm and indifferent since you know that?" Wenqing and Wenlan were speechless. Chu Lian's lips crooked up at one corner. It was just a roughly drawn book of slightly lewd drawings. Young guys and girls wouldn't even give it another glance back in the modern world. Wenlan picked up the book and quickly put it on the side table next to her as if it was a hot potato. The moment she set down the book, she quickly drew her hand back. Her cheeks were even glowing red. Chu Lian wanted to hold her forehead. Weren't these 2 girls too innocent? She ordered Wenqing and Wenlan to change He Sanlang's bedding into the more comfortable and thick set she had brought. She then put a fleece blanket on top of the bedding. This way, it was much more warmer than before when she sat on top of the bed again. After she tested the thickness of the bedding, Chu Lian nodded in satisfaction. She ordered Wenqing and Wenlan to patch up the areas where the seams of the fleece blanket had come apart slightly. When they were done, Wenlan looked outside and realized that it was almost 11 a.m. Captain Guo's adjutant came in to report that they would be having their midday meal soon. The soldiers of the left-wing army would be returning from the front lines soon, so they would be eating together. Joy showed on Wenqing and Wenlan's faces. Third young master was back. The 3 girls washing clothes outside the tent also heard this piece of news. Xiaoyan and the other girls who had been washing clothes numbly suddenly perked up. Xiaoyan's eyes darted in thought before she said, "Let's wash a little slower." "Ah, Sister Xiaoyan, we're almost done with all these. Why don't we finish up and head back to rest earlier?" Xiaoyan's expression turned cold as she drew out her reddened hands from the icy cold water. She said fiercely, "Our general is about to return. I want to show our general how much we've been bullied by that woman while she wasn't around." The other 2 female soldiers' moods lifted upon hearing that. That's right, their general was back. No one would dare to bully them now. Thus, the three girls purposely left their hands a little longer in the cold water until they were almost purple. This way, they would look more pitiful later. Chu Lian didn't care about whatever the three girls outside were thinking at all. Once she heard the report, she simply nodded and had Wenlan go off to boil up a kettle of hot water. He Changdi knew that Chu Lian would come to visit the camp today. Thus, upon receiving the order to return to camp, he quickly led his subordinates and rushed back. With a whip in her hands, Sima Hui led the army and followed He Changdi. The red tassel on her helmet danced in the icy winds. As she stared at He Changdi's heroic figure, she frowned and asked, "Why is Captain He in such a rush today?" Although He Changdi was young and had an absolutely stunning face, he normally kept that handsome face in a cold expression. He was also quick and resolute in his actions, and he was very skilled in martial arts. He had never once lost in the martial arts competitions in the army before. He was normally steady and introverted. Even during that sneak attack by the two Hoons a month ago, he had been able to remain calm and decisive. Thus, it was a rare surprise to see him this hurried and flustered. The military officer accompanying Sima Hui on the way back burst out into laughter. "That damn brat, he's just rushing back to our camp to meet his wife." The military officer spoke a little crudely, but there was a hint of affection in his tone. It was clear that he was close to He Sanlang and maybe even held admiration for the steady and experienced junior officer. Sima Hui was a little stunned for a moment. A bitter feeling passed through her heart, making her unable to speak. The military officer thought that Sima Hui wasn't in the know, so he kindly explained things to her. "That brat is House Jingan's third son. He came out here to this godforsaken northern border in a fit of stupidity. If he were my son, I would have broken his legs. But that brat's pretty lucky. He married a good wife. His wife got a decree from the Empress Dowager to come to the northern border with some supplies. The young couple must not have met for quite some time. Look at how rushed that brat is." TL note. A quick note to clarify things since there was a misinformed review posted on TMR's NU page and I can't reply to the review. Chapters are now being split into 7 or 8 parts instead of 2 or 3. I have been reading the same chapter for 7 days now. I'm splitting chapters into 2 parts now. I split them into 3 parts around the 100 chapter mark because the word count per chapter shot up, but I don't do that anymore because the word count has gone down. I have never split chapters into 8 parts as the reviewer claims. There was a chapter titled Rumors, 8, because the author reused the same chapter title for 4 different chapters, Rumors, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which were then split up into Rumors, 1, 8. Chapters are so short now plot isn't moving for the word count. The author has written 2k Chinese words per chapter for the past 10 or so chapters, where she wrote about 3k Chinese words previously. I understand that it's frustrating to read shorter chapters, but I can't translate more. My wrist strain injuries prevent me from typing too much, and I only get 2 hours of free time on weekdays after I get home from my full-time job. Thank you to all the readers making cute comments about the story and sending their appreciation. You've been keeping me motivated. 3 Unfortunately, I've been getting a little bummed out by some negative comments recently, so I really need a break. Sorry to leave you with this cliffhanger, but I hope you'll understand. TMR will be on hiatus for 1 week, and I'll be back with more chapters on June 12th after this break. Love, Time Bun. Chapter 334, Scram, 1. Sima Hui put on a forced smile as a courteous reply to the military officer. Xiao Hongyu was following right behind He Changdi. He chuckled and whipped his horse onward to keep up with his superior officer. After rushing to the front line as reinforcements, they had managed to defeat the two Hoons while keeping their losses to less than 10% of the right-wing army. It was considered a major victory, so most of the people on the way back to the camp were in very good moods. The soldiers who had gotten kills on the battlefield were beaming with joy. Xiao Hongyu had forged forward bravely in battle, so he had also contributed quite a bit to their victory. The atmosphere amongst the triumphant troops was relaxed. It was likely the best they had felt since the war had started. Thus, they weren't as hasty to get back as they had been on the way to the front lines. Only He Sanlang's squad was rushing back like their lives depended on it. "Brother He, Is there something urgent going on? He Changdi was dressed in a full set of black armor with a grey cloak whipping about in the flurry of snow-speckled winds behind him. Upon hearing Xiao Hongyu's question, He Sanlang turned to glance at him before replying, "Your sister-in-law is coming to the camp today." "What?" Xiao Hongyu's eyes widened in surprise. "Sister-in-law is coming today?" He Sanlang shot a look at him as if he were an idiot. "Brother He, why didn't you say so earlier?" Xiao Hongyu fretted and whipped his horse's rump. His mount neighed before sprinting forward like a shooting star. He Changdi's expression darkened and he urged his own mount on to chase after Xiao Hongyu. That stupid brat. Chu Lian was his wife. Why was he running back so quickly? Was he already sick of living? Actually, what Xiao Hongyu was racing after wasn't Chu Lian herself. In his mind, Chu Lian was equivalent to delicious meat and porridge instead. There was still quite a bit of distance between the front lines and the border troops' camp. The two brothers started chatting idly on the way back. "Brother He, why did sister-in-law come to camp?" "The Empress Dowager's decree," He Changdi replied very succinctly. He was still a man of few words. Xiao Hongyu was smart enough to understand after a moment of thought, so he nodded. "Brother He, I really admire sister-in-law. My father had to threaten me with a stick to make me go to the northern border and join the army. It's an amazing feat for a young lady like sister-in-law to come out to a place like this." Xiao Hongyu's casual words made He Changdi stiffen up. His originally icy expression dropped a few more degrees. However, Xiao Hongyu was just too oblivious to realize that his simple words had roused a hive of bees in He Sanlang's heart. All of a sudden, Xiao Hongyu seemed to have recalled something. The joy that had been on his face completely disappeared, only to be replaced with embarrassment. Xiao Hongyu hesitated for a moment. Then, he asked, "Brother He, sister-in-law won't be going to our tent, right?" He Changdi frowned as he replied, "Brother Guo should be bringing your sister-in-law over there. What's wrong?" Upon hearing He Sanlang's answer, Xiao Hongyu cried out in anguish. He then tried to glance secretly at He Sanlang. Unfortunately, when faced with He Sanlang's gloomy stare, he didn't dare to hide anything and confessed exactly what he had done. "What? Say that one more time." He Changdi wanted to kick this stupid fellow right off his horse. "Brother He, just forgive me this once. I didn't do it on purpose. I was just afraid that Brother Guo would come and search our tent. How about I lend you that lewd book later on? Anyway, I hid it really well. Sister-in-law won't be able to find it at all." He Changdi's face was as black as the bottom of a pot. He didn't even want to bother talking to Xiao Hongyu anymore. Xiao Hongyu followed behind He Sanlang obediently. He knew that he had really done Brother He dirty this time. However, there was also a shred of dissatisfaction in his heart. Xiao Hongyu felt that he hadn't done anything wrong at all. All of them were already married, and Brother His wife had even come thousands of miles to visit him. The two of them were probably going to exchange sweet nothings with each other once they met. He was the only single man in the group. Were they going to bar him from looking at some lewd drawings to release all his pent-up pressure? Xiao Hongyu felt that instead of He Sanlang, he was the one who had suffered some grievous harm. TL note: I'm back from my break and ready to get back to posting daily chapters. Thank you so much for all of your supportive comments in the previous chapter. I won't let negativity get me down and I'll make sure to rest my wrists more often so I can keep going till the end of TMR-3, Time Bun. Chapter 335, Naughty Book 4. As expected, when He Changdi finally led his troops back into camp, a messenger came over to report that Chu Lian was currently in his tent. He Changdi shot a severe glare at Xiao Hongyu. Xiao Hongyu rubbed his nose awkwardly from behind him. He decided to run off with the other troops to have their midday meal and leave He Changdi and Chu Lian alone in the tent. When He Changdi reached his tent, he noticed 3 female soldiers squatting in front, washing clothes. He Changdi furrowed his brows together. He barked, "What are all of you doing here?" His gaze landed on the wash basin and he realized that the garments inside were his clothes. Xiaoyan and the others hadn't expected He Changdi to have returned so early. Their faces were full of surprise. However, Xiaoyan was experienced with dealing with unexpected situations after serving Sima Hui for so long, and she managed to quickly recover. Xiaoyan acted as if she had been wronged and placed her hands, which had turned an ugly purplish red from the cold, on top of the wet clothes in the basin to make them more obvious. She intentionally made her voice soft and weak to draw their pity. "Captain He, we escorted honored lady here. Our general ordered us to serve honored lady, so we had to follow honored lady's orders when she told us to wash these clothes. Although this subordinate was born a lowly servant, this subordinate is still General Sima's personal handmaid." Xiaoyan was right. Chu Lian had indeed been the one to order Wenlan to bring these clothes out for them to wash. However, she had purposely phrased her words to imply that it was an unfair order. As Xiaoyan spoke, she kept sneaking glances at He Chengdi's expression. Unfortunately, she couldn't discern any bit of emotion from He Chengdi's cool and handsome face, so she couldn't tell if her ploy was working. She gritted her teeth and continued. "This subordinate ventures to say that honored lady has taken things too far. Our general has never held any dishonest intentions, yet honored lady has already tried to nip things in the bud. This subordinate has never seen such a thing." Xiaoyan kept her back straight and her head high. She was even a little pleased inside. With this, Captain He should know how unbearable his wife was. Nothing had even happened yet, and Sima Hui wasn't even a threat to their marriage. However, his wife had already tried to discipline Sima Hui's personal handmaid. He Chengdi would surely hate such a petty and jealous wife. Wenqing and Wenlan had heard everything from within the tent. Their faces were flushed red with anger. Wenlan wanted to run right out of the tent to scold Xiaoyan, but Chu Lian held her back. Chu Lian shook her head soundlessly. Wenlan stomped her foot in frustration and walked further away from the tent entrance. Out of sight, out of mind. If she couldn't hear any of the conversation outside, her frustration would surely dissipate. However, Chu Lian stood by the tent flap without moving. There wasn't much of an expression on her face, but her clenched fists hidden by her wide sleeves betrayed her nervousness. He Chengdi was a tall man. Even though Xiaoyan wasn't short, he could still look down upon her. He swept the 3 female soldiers with an icy glare. Next, his lips moved and his low, magnetic voice resounded in a frighteningly cold tone. He only had one word to say. "Scram." That short syllable was enough to make Xiaoyan and the others shudder. Their eyes widened in disbelief. They couldn't believe He Chengdi could act like that. A storm seemed to be brewing in the dark pools that served as He Sanlang's eyes. He focused his gaze on Xiaoyan, who struggled to breathe when faced with eyes as icy as those. "What? Didn't you hear me? I told you all to scram." It was as if a basin of cold water had been dunked over the 3 female soldiers' heads. Their bodies started trembling. They ran off helter-skelter after a moment's pause, even stumbling in their efforts to leave as quickly as possible. The soldier standing on guard nearby was filled to the brim with admiration for his captain. He stood up even straighter, looking just like a sharp spear. He Sanlang's gaze turned to the wooden basin by his feet next. When he thought of how his clothes had been handled by those female soldiers, his brows drew together in disdain. He then ordered, "Throw out all the clothes in this basin." Chapter 336, Getting Along in the Tent. 1. Chu Lian had been standing behind the tent flap expressionlessly. The corners of her lips curled up when she heard He Chengdi's words, and she finally lifted up the tent flap to peer outside. The moment the flap was lifted, she met directly with the black pools of He Chengdi's eyes, causing her to cough awkwardly. Although her lunatic husband was usually rather disagreeable, it seemed like he was able to see through deceptions when needed. He hadn't failed her expectations at all. Chu Lian didn't realize that her eyes were bright and sparkly right now. If she looked at anyone right now with that seemingly shining expression, anyone would be able to tell that she was in an extremely good mood at the moment. Like a miniature sun, Chu Lian's smile seemed to cast bright rays on He Sanlang, driving away all the gloomy clouds that had just gathered in his heart. She seemed to be exuding a natural charisma, attracting his gaze to her without him even realizing. When Chu Lian looked down and noticed that a soldier was about to follow He Chengdi's orders and throw away the clothes that Xiaoyan and the other female soldiers had been washing, she frowned and spoke up. Don't throw those away. Let them dry and give them to any soldiers who need more clothes for winter. The soldier hadn't expected Chu Lian to give him such an order. Although he had thought that it was a pity to throw away these perfectly good clothes, these were the captain's own clothes, so they didn't have any right to do anything else to them. The soldier turned to his superior officer with a questioning look. He Changdis' brows drew together as his lips formed a thin line. Do as honored lady says. When the soldier heard that, he took away the basin of clothes with a happy smile. Xiaoyan and the others were standing in a hidden corner some distance away, watching the scene in front of He Changdis' tent. When Xiaoyan saw that the soldier was taking away the wet clothes and giving them away to other soldiers who needed them, her face contorted into an ugly expression. She wasn't stupid. She knew that He Sanlang had done that out of disdain for them. They were Sima Hui's subordinates. By doing so, wasn't he showing his contempt for Sima Hui as well? An indignant expression covered Xiaoyan's face. Chu Lian's eyes were turned up into crescents as she looked up at the travel-worn He Sanlang. He was still wearing his cloak and helmet. It was clear that he had rushed straight over from the battlefield. Come in, it's too windy outside. He Sanlang paused before entering and struggled to keep his usual cold expression on. Unfortunately, after he passed under the raised tent flap and was met with the warm air within the tent, the tips of his ears reddened unconsciously. That cute, pink flush didn't match with his cool and handsome face at all. Once he entered the tent, He Changdi glanced towards Chu Lian's ankle twice. Following that, he took off his cloak, helmet and scabbard and passed them to the waiting Wenqing and Wenlan. Although his voice sounded the same and his tone seemed as icy as usual, anyone would be able to tell that there was a shred of concern in his question. Has your wound recovered? Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes were upturned in a smile as she stared at the tall He Sanlang. She had been feeling a little awkward earlier, but now she was feeling as thick-skinned as she could be. I can walk now, just not too quickly. Long legs carried He Changdi over to Chu Lian's side in just 3 strides. He pushed aside the long hem of his robe and sat down next to Chu Lian. The originally stiff and hard bed had suddenly turned into warm and soft bedding. The difference in his expectations made him freeze for a second. An instant of panic flashed across his normally calm and collected face. However, he quickly concealed his flustered emotions. His seemingly casual gaze brushed over Chu Lian for a moment, as if checking whether she had detected his moment of abnormality. His thin lips pressed together as he bent over, preparing to lift up Chu Lian's skirt. Chapter 337, Getting Along in the Tent, 2. Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He Sanlang seemed to have gotten into a bad habit. Back in the cave, he had also lifted up her skirt without any warning. She was already so used to it that she was no longer surprised by his actions. However, Wenqing and Wenlan were still in the tent. Showing off such an intimate action with an audience made Chu Lian blush a little. She drew her legs back with the intention to escape, but before she could, He Changdi caught hold of her calf. Don't move, he murmured. Chu Lian froze on the spot. Wenqing and Wenlan exchanged glances, sharing their joy. Wenqing sensibly said, Third young master, third young madam hasn't eaten yet. We servants will go and bring some food back. Without waiting for permission from their 2 masters, Wenqing tugged Wenlan behind her and escaped from the tent. Now that their audience was gone, Chu Lian relaxed. She looked down and watched as He Changdi's slender fingers rolled up her pants leg before gently removing her sock. Her slender and fair leg was now exposed to his eyes, from her calf to her ankle. As He Sanlang's warm palms brushed along her calf, the wound around her ankle was revealed. The severe-looking wound had already scabbed over. However, since the skin around it was as white as snow, the dark-colored scab stood out even more and seemed a little eye-catching. A glint flashed through He Changdi's eyes as he looked at the wound. His Adam's apple trembled a little as he touched the scab gently. Does it still hurt? Chu Lian was enjoying the warmth of his palms as they massaged her skin. Her almond-shaped eyes turned into narrow slits, showing how much she was enjoying the massage. She shook her head in reply to his question. It stopped hurting after it scabbed over. It just gets a little itchy at night under the warm blankets. He Sanlang carefully inspected her wound for a while more. When he realized that her wound was indeed much better after it had scabbed over, he breathed a soft sigh of relief. A weight he hadn't even known he had been carrying seemed to have fallen from his shoulders. When Changdi noticed that the leg he was still holding in his hands was turning a little cool, he quickly put Chu Lian's sock and shoe back on. His palm lingered on that smooth leg for a moment as if he couldn't bear to let go, before he finally stood up. All the care he had just shown had been carried out from his subconscious mind. He hadn't thought much of it while checking her wound, but now that he was done, the atmosphere seemed to turn a little awkward. Chu Lian didn't think much of the intimacy at all. She turned to continue staring at Changdi with her wide eyes. As she blinked, she felt that Sanlang seemed to be exceptionally handsome today. Could her lunatic husband possibly have been cured? Changdi hadn't expected Chu Lian to stare directly at him without any reserve or shyness. His originally relaxed mood slowly turned tense once again. While his eyes still seemed like dark, icy pools, his neck and the tips of his ears were flushing red, completely out of his control. Chu Lian noticed his reaction and found it fun, so she simply continued staring. They were husband and wife anyway, and Changdi was a good-looking man after all. Since she couldn't consummate their marriage, wasn't she at least allowed to admire her eye candy as much as she wanted? Changdi felt trapped by Chu Lian's gaze. He felt uncomfortable at the start and he was about to speak up to reprimand this wicked woman about her unreserved staring. Such loose behavior was unbecoming of a noble lady. As his eyes wandered about the inside of the tent a little absent-mindedly, his tense gaze abruptly concentrated on one spot. That familiar-looking blue leather-bound book seemed to leap into view, causing not only his neck and ears, but even his entire face to turn red in a full-on blush. That Xiao Hongyu. He was going to take that brat to task. Changdi shared a tent with Xiao Hongyu, so he knew that damn brat liked to read that blue leather book at night while hiding under the lamp, acting like some sneak thief. He only had to glance at it once or twice before realizing what it was. It was just some lewd drawings. He wasn't interested and hadn't minded Xiao Hongyu's reading at all before this. However, the fact that it was lying in such an obvious spot today didn't bode well for him. That wicked woman Chu Lian must have discovered it. She might even have opened it. That shameless, wicked woman. She actually looked at those sorts of drawings. Surely that wicked woman didn't think that this naughty book was his. Chapter 338, The First Kiss, 1. Although the changes in Sanlang's expression weren't obvious, Chu Lian had been watching him all this time, so she noticed how the glint in his eyes had changed. When she followed Sanlang's line of sight, the crude naughty book that she had casually thrown onto the side table came into view. Chu Lian blinked as curiosity welled up inside her. Changdi normally seemed like a cool and aloof type of guy. She had never seen him smiling openly even in front of matriarch He. Would a man as icy and reserved as Sanlang really read that kind of book? Of course, Chu Lian didn't intend to judge him. He was a man after all, and it was pretty common for them to watch a few movies here and there. In the modern world, they might even have an entire hard disk's worth of movies featuring their idols. She was simply curious. Chu Lian was definitely not going to admit that this was one of her stranger interests. Changdi's body stiffened slightly. He shifted his gaze away from that blue leather-bound book forcefully. He then stood up abruptly and walked over to Chu Lian's other side before sitting down again. With his height and the armor he was wearing, as long as he bent his body forward slightly, he could block Chu Lian's view of that blue book on the table. Chu Lian looked at him strangely. Why did you shift to the other side so suddenly? Changdi cast a quick glance over and met Chu Lian's perplexed gaze. It was only then that he pretended to be calm and collected as he replied, I'm more used to sitting on this side. Chu Lian muttered to herself, what a weird habit. Aren't you still sitting on the same bed? When Sanlang saw that Chu Lian hadn't mentioned the little blue book at all, he heaved a sigh of relief inwardly. However, since he was leaning his body a little sideways, his current pose seemed rather strange. Chu Lian hadn't realized why Sanlang had moved at first. It was only when she turned her gaze in the direction of the side table that she realized what had happened. Her first reaction was to burst out into laughter within her mind. This lunatic husband of hers was trying to bury his head in the sand and ignore the book. He Sanlang hadn't even fully relaxed when Chu Lian's uniquely soft tone rang out, "So you like looking at lewd drawings?" He Changdi's cool and handsome face instantly exploded into a furious blush that covered his entire face. His skin was the type that tended towards lighter tones, so the flush of red was extremely obvious. Chu Lian watched the changes on He Sanlang's face in surprise. She finally understood what the phrase ripe as a peach meant. He Changdi's deep and serious eyes were now filled with embarrassment. His lips were pressed so tightly together that they formed a thin line. His face got redder and redder. After a moment of struggle, he managed to spit out a single sentence, "That book's not mine." Chu Lian was already rolling on the floor in laughter within her mind. She was holding on to the last vestiges of her calm facade with all her might. She hadn't expected He Changdi to be so cute when embarrassed, so she hadn't been able to hold back her impulse to tease him just now. "I found that book under your bed, so who else could it belong to? Who would put a book like that under someone else's bed?" He just knew that this would happen. It was in this wicked woman's nature to be utterly infuriating. He had clearly been telling the truth, yet she refused to believe a single word of it. Frustration built up within He Sanlang's chest. However, there was no way for him to let it out. His current expression was extremely entertaining. Chu Lian just couldn't resist throwing in another jab. "There aren't any women in most military camps, so it's normal to look at these kinds of books. But there's nothing much to this one. There were just some normal positions shown in that book. They didn't even change the backgrounds of the drawings, it was too primitive." Upon hearing Chu Lian's statement, a dangerous glint started shining in He Changdi's eyes. "So you looked inside?" He abruptly cut in with a sinister-sounding tone. TL note, I realized I couldn't make you guys wait another day for the next chapter considering the spoiler in the chapter title, so, click on for what we've all been waiting for tilde. Chapter 339, First Kiss, 2. Chu Lian hadn't detected the change in his mood, so she openly admitted her doings. "Millimeter, I flipped through it." He Changdi's eyes instantly opened wide. His face was still flushed as he pointed at Chu Lian with a trembling hand. "You. Chu Lian, you loose woman." "Ah!" It was Chu Lian's turn to open her eyes wide. Just looking at some lewd drawings was enough to condemn her as a loose woman? They were such lousy drawings too. A corner of her lips tugged downwards. Or should she say that this lunatic husband of hers was just too inexperienced? Chu Lian didn't care about He Sanlang's reprimand at all. She simply rolled her eyes wordlessly. "Isn't your book too low quality?" Even with such poor quality, He Sanlang was still hiding it like it was some treasure. He Changdi almost exploded on the spot upon hearing that. His frustration was stuck in his chest with nowhere to go. That chattering mouth of hers was really annoying as well. His pupils contracted. He finally lost control of his emotions and grabbed her shoulders before sweeping her up in a fierce kiss. Chu Lian had just been in the middle of enjoying He Sanlang's blushing a second ago. In the next instant, her mind went completely blank. She could feel the pressure of something soft and slightly cool on her lips. She blinked once, then twice, before she finally came to her senses. He Sanlang was kissing her by force. She immediately put her hands on He Changdi's chest and instinctively struggled as she tried to push him away. However, He Changdi's palms were so strong that they seemed to be made of steel. They held onto her slender shoulders so that she couldn't move. Chu Lian didn't understand what kind of fit he was having now. The fires of He Sanlang's rage were still burning brightly. If he were to let go of her mouth and let her continue speaking, who knew what new ways she would find to infuriate him? Thus, he simply kept her mouth occupied. He still hadn't realized that his heart was beating tremendously fast while he was kissing Chu Lian. He Changdi was still a virgin after all. He didn't even know how to kiss, let alone act out the scenes shown in that naughty little book. When he realized that Chu Lian was struggling, his only reaction was to press his lips even more forcefully onto hers, as if he could subdue her by doing so. How naive. Although the mouth that was always filled with words meant to provoke him was annoying, it tasted rather good. He wondered what Chu Lian had just eaten. There was an addictively sweet taste on her soft, supple lips that drew him back time and time again for more. Chu Lian made muffled sounds of complaint. Their teeth were grinding against each other, so she was feeling very uncomfortable. However, He Sanlang was like a bull locked on his target. He just tried going forward without turning back. While wailing in her heart, Chu Lian had no choice but to part her lips slightly so she could catch He Changdi's upper lip between her own, giving herself a chance to breathe. He Sanlang reacted as if he had just been struck by lightning. His body stiffened unconsciously as enlightenment seemed to have dawned upon him from the heavens. It was easy for men to grasp what to do in these kinds of situations without any prior experience. Chu Lian's simple action had somehow opened a gateway in his mind. He Changdi had somehow managed to gain insight into the art of kissing in a mere instant. He mounted a counterattack, causing Chu Lian to lose her advantageous position and face a pending defeat. By the time He Changdi finally let go of her, Chu Lian's lips had already turned red and swollen. Chu Lian was a little annoyed. She covered her lips and glared fiercely at He Sanlang. He Changdi, would it kill you to be gentle? It was He Sanlang's first time experiencing something so wonderful. He had still been panting for breath while immersed in the recollection of the sweet taste on his lips. Chu Lian's complaint snapped him back to reality and caused his expression to darken, as if his pride as a man had been questioned. However, he did feel a little guilty, since he hadn't known how to kiss at all at the start. It was only later on that he had discovered the true technique of kissing, so he held back his retort. After struggling for a moment, he finally managed to reply with a subdued, "I'll be gentler next time." Chu Lian rolled her eyes. She muttered to herself, "There won't be a next time." Although it was just a kiss, it felt like she had almost been completely eaten up by him. That feeling was just too scary. Chapter 340, Having a Meal Together. 1. He Sanlang's senses were quite sharp. Although Chu Lian had spoken in a low mutter, he still managed to catch it with his hearing. His thick brows drew together to express his clear displeasure at Chu Lian's words. "Chu Lian, what did you say?" Chu Lian covered her mouth and gave off an awkward titter. She leaned her body away from He Sanlang's and quickly replied, "Nothing." She didn't dare to provoke him any longer. He Sanlang was just too dangerous right now. Chu Lian was smart enough not to bait the tiger in its den. When He Changdi saw that he had somehow managed to survive this whole turn of events, he breathed a sigh of relief in his mind. He stood up, walked over to the small table and pretended to bump into the table accidentally, causing the little blue book to drop into the brazier placed conveniently next to the table. The book was instantly consumed by the flames within. Chu Lian rolled her eyes. Anyone with eyes could tell that He Sanlang had done that on purpose. He Changdi turned his body towards hers and stated in a calm tone, "I bumped it accidentally. Never mind, it's no loss if it burns." It really was no loss to He Sanlang. He couldn't wait to see it disappear from the face of the earth. Xiao Hongyu was likely the only one who would cry over the loss. His very last book of obscene drawings had been burned into ashes. He must be Destiny's favorite plaything. While standing outside the tent, Wenqing and Wenlan secretly exchanged glances. After confirming that there weren't abnormal sounds coming from within the tent, they announced their return. "Third young master, third young madam, we servants have brought back your meals." Chu Lian fixed her disarrayed hair before calling Wenqing and Wenlan in. Wenqing moved the small table over to where the couple was seated. Wenlan then took out the dishes from within the box they had brought over and placed them on the table. While Wenqing busied herself with setting out chopsticks and bowls for the couple, she explained, "Captain Gua sent a message saying that something came up and that he won't be able to accompany third young madam for the meal. This servant is to inform you that Lieutenant Xiao has also gone over to Captain Guo's side." Chu Lian nodded with a slight upward tilt of her lips. It seemed like the officers of the right-wing army were really good at reading the situation. They seemed to be letting her and He Changdi have some private time to themselves. She stopped her wandering thoughts and turned her gaze to the table in front of her instead. When she looked at the simple, almost crude dishes displayed on the table's surface, she exclaimed in surprise, "Is this what you eat normally?" Although He Sanlang's position in the army wasn't very high, He was still an elite captain who commanded a few hundred men. Surely his meals shouldn't be this poor. Changdi shot a glance at her and nodded. What he left unsaid was that these dishes were likely what Captain Guo had specially ordered the cookhouse to send them, considering that Chu Lian was a special guest. Chu Lian eyed the wheat pancakes before her, which looked as hard as bricks, and some unknown food that was so charred that she couldn't tell what it had originally been. The nicest-looking dish was probably the plate of broiled preserved meat in the center. Although there was steam rising from the dishes, Chu Lian lost all appetite from the whiff that she got. When Changdi saw that her brows had creased together, he wasn't too eager to start the meal either. He asked, "No appetite?" After thinking for a bit, he understood what had happened. To the soldiers here in the north, the taste of Chu Lian's normal fare would be heavenly or almost inconceivable. How would she be able to swallow these military rations? Wenqing and Wenlan felt anxious for their young mistress. Even they couldn't muster up any appetite looking at these dishes, let alone their third young madam. After a slight pause, Sanlang turned to Wenqing and Wenlan. "Go and cook something else for your third young madam." He turned to Chu Lian, who was sitting opposite him, and gave her a suggestion. "If you're feeling hungry, why don't you have some honey water first?" He knew that Chu Lian had the habit of drinking honey water. Chu Lian didn't really want to eat the food served here in the northern border camp. However, when she looked at the food on the table, she could tell that they had been given enough for two. The northern border troops were already lacking in supplies, so it wouldn't be good to waste any of it. She reached out and pointed at the plates. "Then what about these? TL note, I think it's better not to post pictures of the terrible cooking you." Chapter 341, Having a Meal Together, 2. Sanlang looked at the crude porcelain bowl in front of her. He took her bowl and put it in front of himself before replying in his usual magnetic tone, "I'll eat these. Wait for Wenqing and Wenlan to make you something else." After saying so, Changdi took up the bowl of charred mystery food and started gulping it down furiously. Chu Lian saw that he had put the less perishable wheat pancakes and salted meat to one side and had only put the two bowls of mystery food in front of himself. She could guess at what he was intending to do. Sanlang was going to finish the two bowls of charred stuff by himself in order not to waste food. Her chest felt heavy for some reason and she started to feel pity for Changdi. Chu Lian suddenly called out and stopped the maidservants who were about to go out to look for a place to cook. Wenqing and Wenlan looked at Chu Lian strangely. "Do you have any other orders, third young madam?" Chu Lian shook her head. "There's no need to go to the trouble. I'll eat these." It wasn't as if she was a spoiled princess who couldn't bear the slightest bit of suffering. Since thousands of men in the army were eating these every day and even Changdi was eating this kind of food, then why couldn't she do the same? Wenqing and Wenlan's eyes widened. They couldn't believe that their third young madam, who would rather starve than eat something terrible, would actually choose to eat such unappetizing food. However, since their master had given the order, they couldn't disobey her. They retreated outside the tent so as not to disturb the young couple. Changdi clearly hadn't expected Chu Lian to actually eat this poor fare. He remained stunned for a second before recovering his sense. Thinking that Chu Lian was only interested in the food because he was gulping it down quickly, he gave her a kind reminder. "Chu Lian, don't look at how quickly I'm eating this. Actually, it doesn't really taste that good. It's like heaven and earth compared to your cooking." Chu Lian looked at him before pointing at the bowl he had taken from her. "Pass it to me." Sanlang had no other choice but to follow her order. He knew that he wouldn't be able to convince her at this point. He thought for a moment before pouring half of the mystery food from her bowl into his own. He then told Wenqing to pour a bowl of warm water for them. He placed the bowl in front of Chu Lian before speaking up in a light and casual tone, as if he wasn't concerned at all. However, anyone would be able to sense the care in his words. "This bin paste doesn't taste good and you're probably not used to this kind of taste. Just have a little taste of it. The wheat pancakes are too hard, so tear them up and soak them in the warm water before you eat them. You can have some of the salted meat as well." Chu Lian nodded and took her bowl from him. She looked at the black substance that she now knew was bin paste and gulped. Following that, She used her spoon to scoop up some bin paste and placed it gingerly into her mouth. Almost immediately, that weird taste overwhelmed her tongue and she almost spit out the paste in her mouth. In the end, she forced herself to swallow it. After managing that feat, she quickly drank some warm water to wash away the lingering taste in her mouth. She was absolutely shocked at the taste of this strange bean paste. She had no idea how it was made either. The taste of it was almost at the level of surströmming, one of the worst foods in the world. As much as Chu Lian had tried to mentally prepare herself, she just couldn't summon the courage to take a second bite out of the small bowl of bean paste in front of her. The hint of a smile could be seen in the crease of He Sanlang's eyes, a rarity for the normally ice-faced man. He took Chu Lian's bowl back and pushed the bowl of wheat pancakes to Chu Lian. "Eat this instead." He took out a fine-looking dagger from his waistband and cut off a few pieces from the salted meat with practiced movements before putting them in her bowl. "If it's tasteless to you, then take a bite of salted meat." Chu Lian nibbled at a wheat pancake and heaved a sigh of relief upon finding that it tasted pretty normal. Although it couldn't be considered delicious, it was like gourmet food compared to the bean paste. While taking small bites from the pancake, she glanced at He Changdi from time to time. She watched as he expressionlessly finished off the 2 bowls of bean paste and cut off a small piece of salted meat. He chewed on the salted meat for a while before setting down his chopsticks. Chapter 342, Getting Angry. 1. Chu Lian had always been picky with her food. Although she managed to force herself to eat a little bit of each dish in front of her, she could feel her limits and sensibly set down her chopsticks after a few bites. He Sanlang didn't say anything upon noticing her actions. He simply took her leftover wheat pancake and finished it. Chu Lian blinked and watched as He Changdi ate all of her leftovers with a coldly handsome face. She felt both embarrassed and guilty at the same time. In order to lessen her awkwardness, Chu Lian tried to start up a conversation. "So this is what all the officers in this camp eat every day." He Changdi finished drinking all the warm water left in the bowl and wiped his mouth with a handkerchief that Wenlan passed over before turning to look at the young and weak woman in front of him. The wicked woman's doe-like eyes were shining brightly, like a little creature filled with curiosity. He Sanlang shifted his gaze away as casually as he could before carefully replying, "Millimeter, even the great general is no exception." Chu Lian wailed in her heart at the bleakness of his answer. However, she also found it strange. Even the unpaid volunteer forces formed to fight against sudden rebellions, like the Hun army from history, wouldn't be forced into conditions where they only had bean paste to eat and no grains at all. While He Sanlang's position wasn't very high, he was still a captain. She had come today with an imperial decree to bring them supplies, so Great General Qian had specially invited her to stay for a meal. They wouldn't normally welcome their guests with such poor fare, what more an honored lady representing the Empress Dowager. However, all they had sent over were these dishes. They had been given some salted meat and wheat pancakes at least. But what about the lowest-ranked soldiers? Chu Lian's eyes abruptly widened into huge circles. She gulped and suddenly moved over to He Changdi's side. When Wenqing and Wenlan noticed their young madam's sudden action, they were stunned for a moment before their cheeks flushed red and they quickly retreated out of the tent. Absence really did make the heart grow fonder. Third young madam hadn't gotten enough alone time with third young master. When Chu Lian sat down next to He Changdi, she even squeezed closer to him, as if they weren't already close enough. All He Changdi could smell right now was Chu Lian's uniquely refreshing and sweet scent. His entire body froze instantly as he tried to figure out what Chu Lian was trying to do. He wanted to push the wicked woman away, but his hands just refused to listen to him. Her familiar scent drew him back to the memories of that wonderful kiss from before. The tips of He Sanlang's ears turned red and he gulped unconsciously, causing his Adam's apple to move noticeably. The depths of his pupils seemed to turn even darker as his eyes darted towards Chu Lian's tender, pink lips. However, Chu Lian's next words made him drop his wayward thoughts completely. He Sanlang, tell me honestly, is the border army running out of food? He Changdi's body seemed to have frozen into a statue-like stillness. His eyes narrowed dangerously and he grabbed Chu Lian's arm with his large hand. In a deep and icy tone, he questioned, "How do you know that?" Chu Lian hadn't noticed his strange mood yet. Her only reaction was to widen her eyes as shock filled her heart. So it was true. Didn't your manservant Lai Yu follow you here to the northern border? How come I haven't seen him these few days? Lai Yu definitely wasn't in the camp. Otherwise, he should have come out to welcome her in He Changdi's stead by now. However, he wasn't at Liangzhou's He estate either. Chu Lian's eyes lit up. You've sent him out to secure supplies. Chu Lian's bright and sparkling eyes were filled with certainty as she looked up at He Changdi. However, the sight that met her eyes was enough to make her tremble in fright. The look in He Sanlang's eyes was cold. He looked exactly like the day they had first met, back on their wedding night, as if he wanted to chew her up and spit out her blood. Back then, when he had almost strangled her to death. Goosebumps rose on Chu Lian's head and she subconsciously took a step back, trying to distance herself from the danger before her. However, He Changdi maintained his tight hold on her upper arm and refused to let her move. His dangerous gaze was locked onto Chu Lian's eyes, as if he was trying to see into her heart and all her thoughts with his eyes alone. He asked again, "How do you know that?" His tone was even more sinister than the first time. He had been able to make preparations in advance because he had experienced it in his previous life, but how had Chu Lian been able to find out about the lack of supplies? Chapter 343, Getting Angry, 2. By now, Chu Lian had realized that there was something wrong with He Sanlang. However, she still didn't know how she had triggered him. She pushed at the hand grasping her arm and pitifully complained, "Can't you loosen up a little? You're hurting me." "What do you mean? How do I know that?" "No need for someone to tell me. Anyone with a brain would be able to guess it. If the meal they sent to welcome me as an envoy of the Empress Dowager looks like this, then what could the normal soldiers be eating?" He Changdi continued his one-sided, fierce-staring contest, even as Chu Lian gave him a wounded look. Just as she was about to let loose a furious scolding and start struggling, he finally let go. In his past life, that wicked woman had cast a shadow over his heart, and a tremendous amount of fear still remained within him. Now that he realized he was somehow starting to care for this wicked woman, that is, if she was truly just this lifetime's Chu Lian, he was both afraid and uncertain. He was so very scared that the Chu Lian in front of him would disappear, only to be replaced by the tormentor of his previous life. That was why his reaction had been so over the top. Chu Lian was still in the dark about the reason behind He Changdi's abrupt change. She gingerly rubbed her arm and glared at the silent lunatic next to her, full of complaints. "It's definitely bruise. He Sanlang, what kind of fit are you having?" When He Changdi finally came to his senses, the first emotion that came to his mind was regret. He didn't know how to face Chu Lian, so he bowed his head and let his long, thick eyelashes obscure his eyes. It was only after a long moment that he managed to say, "I didn't do that on purpose." Chu Lian rolled her eyes and sighed. She called for Wenqing and Wenlan. "Help me up." Wenqing carefully helped Chu Lian to her feet. When she touched Chu Lian's arm, her mistress let out a hiss of pain. Wenqing was startled. She secretly glanced at He Changdi. Chu Lian straightened out her skirts before turning to the dazed He Sanlang sitting opposite her. "Husband, it's getting late. If I dally any longer, it'll be dark by the time I return to the He estate." Without giving He Changdi the chance to answer, she turned around and ordered Wenqing and Wenlan to help her into her cape. She stuffed her hands into her hand warmer before lifting the tent flap and leaving the tent. Judging by how cold Chu Lian had suddenly become, anyone could tell that there was trouble in paradise. When He Changdi saw that Chu Lian had left without even glancing back, his expression turned ugly. He resisted the urge to escort her out. The tent flap fell. It was only after it stopped moving that He Changdi raised his arm, preparing to shove over the small table still filled with food. However, upon seeing the leftover wheat pancakes and salted meat, he had to hold himself back. In the end, without any other way to vent his anger and frustration, he kicked over the brazier on the side. Bright red coals spilled all over the ground. Luckily, the floor of his tent was just bare dirt, so the coals didn't set fire to anything. He Sanlang stared at the rolling hot coals on the ground with a dark look in his eyes. He paced around the tent twice in anger before sitting back down on his bed. The originally hard, damp bedding had turned into a soft and warm one. The fleece blanket laid out on top was even more comfortable than the one he had brought with him from the capital. There were also flowers embroidered on the blanket, so he could tell that it belonged to a woman. He Sanlang brushed the surface of the bed with his long fingers before checking the insides of his mattress. The mess of dried grass within had disappeared, replaced by a soft woolen blanket. As the image of that wicked woman gritting her teeth and replacing his bedding for him came to mind, he could no longer sit still. He slammed the bed with his fist in a last show of temper before grabbing his cloak and dashing out of the tent after Chu Lian. Chapter 344, Lacking Supplies, 1. As he Sanlang exited his tent, he happened to bump into Sima Hui. When Sima Hui noticed he Sanlang, she pulled her horse along and quickly strode over with a smile on her lips. She was about to greet him when he Sanlang simply moved right past her. Sima Hui's hand hung frozen in the air. An awkward expression appeared on her face. Sima Hui could only return to the main camp in a gloomy mood, disappointed. After giving her report in the commander's tent, she met her adjutant Xiaoyan and 2 other female soldiers who had been waiting outside. Her adjutant's expression wasn't very good. Her hands were red from frostbite and her eyes were both reddened and swollen from tears. When Sima Hui saw the state that Xiaoyan was in, her expression changed immediately. What happened? Xiaoyan simply looked down and bit her lip without speaking, which only emphasized her pitiful appearance. In the end, the female soldiers behind her were the first to lose their patience. They immediately began to spill their complaints. "General, you have to mete out justice for Sister Xiaoyan and your subordinates." Sima Hui took a deep breath to control her anger. Then, she ordered, "Follow me back to camp and explain everything there." The 3 women obediently agreed and followed behind Sima Hui as they made their way back to their own tent. When her subordinates finally finished reporting the entire chain of events, Sima Hui looked up at Xiaoyan, who was standing before her. She hesitated for a moment before asking, "Xiaoyan, tell me if what they said was true." The adjutant Xiaoyan didn't know what was going on. Although the general's voice was as gentle as usual, she could feel her heart tightening with apprehension. She sent a careful glance at Sima Hui before gritting her teeth and nodding. "Miss, everything they said is true. Honored Lady Genie didn't show you a single ounce of respect. She even made trouble for this servant on purpose. She might have something against you because of Captain He. Her young miss had always protected her, she couldn't even count the number of times she had done so." Xiaoyan believed that this time would be no exception. As long as her young miss wanted to fight for the man, with her around to plot for her young miss, Captain He was practically in the bag already. Xiaoyan was brimming with self-confidence. However, this time, she might really have overestimated her own value. Disappointment flashed through Sima Hui's eyes. She briefly hesitated before finally saying, "Xiaoyan, you know what your punishment should be. Go and mete it out yourself. I won't need you to serve by my side any longer, let Xiaoju take your place." Sima Hui wasn't a stupid person. There was a reason why she had managed to earn the position of general at such a young age. While old General Sima had been alive, he had personally taught her everything he knew. Later on, she had also spent almost 5 years in the army, starting from the lowest rank. Xiaoyan had grown up together with her and had served her as her personal handmaid for all that time. Although she had already gotten used to spoiling Xiaoyan, Sima Hui still stood by her own principles. Xiaoyan had crossed the line and Sima Hui had no mercy for offenders. Xiaoyan had thought to borrow her general's power to intimidate Chu Lian. She assumed that her long years of service would lessen any consequences. Even if her mistress found out the truth, the worst punishment she would receive would only amount to a light reprimand. Xiaoyan never expected her mistress to dismiss her directly from her personal service. That punishment was even worse than sentencing her to 50 strikes of the rod. Xiaoyan's previous calm instantly turned into panic and fear. "Miss, if this servant has done something to displease you, please punish this servant directly. Please don't send this servant away. The old general has already gone. This servant only has one master left." This time, Sima Hui remained unmoved by her pleas. With a wave of her hand, her 2 female guards stuffed Xiaoyon's mouth with cloth and took her away. As for the 2 remaining female soldiers, when they saw how Xiaoyon had ended up, they lost all the courage to speak. They knelt down and lowered their heads, trembling with fear. Without any prompting from Sima Hui, they began to beg for mercy as they cried, "General, it was Sister Xiaoyon who ordered us to do everything. It wasn't our idea at all. General, please have mercy on us." Sima Hui's handsome face was all cold. Her brows were drawn together and her eyes were filled with fatigue and disappointment. With another wave of her hand, the 2 remaining female soldiers were also taken away. To their dismissal, Sima Hui included an additional order. "Take these 2 to captain his tent and let him decide their punishment." Chapter 345, Lacking Supplies, 2. There was only silence in her warm tent, now. After a few days and nights of fighting, she should have long been sound asleep in bed, but Sima Hui wasn't sleepy at all. She listened to the north wind howling outside her tent with a bitter and helpless feeling in her heart. Actually, when she had returned to the main tent, Xiaoju had already reported the day's events to her. She just hadn't expected Xiaoyon to have betrayed her expectations so badly. The corner of Sima Hui's lips tugged downwards bitterly. Xiaoyon had been too naive. Honored Lady Genie had managed to teach them a lesson with nary a change in expression. How could someone like that be taken down by such a weak scheme? A few moments ago, when she had passed by the hurried captain, he had most likely been chasing after that honored Lady Genie. She was a little curious about this honored Lady Genie now. As Sima Hui immersed herself in her thoughts, Xiaoju brought over some food. She knew that her young miss was still angry over Xiaoyon, so Xiaoju was even more careful and conscientious in her service. "General, please eat. You haven't eaten anything since you've returned." Sima Hui took a deep breath to calm her emotions and nodded. When she picked up the silver chopsticks on the table, her gaze took in the food displayed before her. Sima Hui was momentarily stunned. She asked, "Why isn't there any rice today?" Although Sima Hui's ancestors were from Shandong, her likings were more akin to her mother's, who had come from the southern parts of the country where there were many lakes and rivers. She loved rice. When she had the luxury to, she would rarely eat things made of flour as her main dish. It was usually Xiaoju who took care of her clothing and food in the main camp. She usually had rice or porridge for all 3 meals of the day. However, there wasn't a single grain of rice in any of the dishes before her. What was going on? Xiaoju sunk into silence, but after a moment, she said, "General, we've used up all the rice we brought with us." Sima Hui paused in thought for a short while, but ultimately, she didn't say anything. She picked up a wheat pancake and bit into it. In the end, she had to pair it with water before she managed to swallow the tough pancake. She looked again at the other dishes. There was a small saucer of some sort of black sauce and half a plate of salted meat. She set down the wheat pancake in her hands and asked, "Is this what all the officers in camp eat every day?" With Xiaoyon's example before her, Xiaoju didn't dare to hide anything from her general. "Yes, this is what this servant was given by the cooks in camp. Even the great general himself eats food like this. The dried meat and sauce were specially given to you because of General Qian's orders." Sima Hui's brows furrowed. Her gut told her that something wasn't right. "Other than those under my command, what do the normal soldiers eat?" For the soldiers who aren't deployed at the front lines, they get 2 bowls of bean porridge and 1 wheat pancake each day. The soldiers at the front lines get 3 meals a day and each meal consists of 1 wheat pancake and a bowl of bean porridge. Upon getting this answer, Sima Hui's eyes widened in shock. When did the border troops start eating bean porridge? Xiaoju was much more reliable than Xiaoyon. She had a conscientious personality, so she normally scouted for more news in camp. "They started eating bean porridge even before we arrived. However, that had only been for 1 meal a day back then. There was also some rice porridge in the morning and night. However, since the end of last month, the camp has completely stopped eating rice. The quartermaster said that they are saving the grains to pass the winter." Sima Hui wasn't that naive. Her expression was full of worry. She stood up and walked over the tent entrance. The moment she lifted the flap, a bone-piercingly cold wind came barreling in from outside, complete with ice and snow. It was enough to make anyone shiver. Saving supplies? Who would start saving supplies in winter? Their men would freeze to death if they tried to cut back in this cold weather. She was afraid that their supplies had most likely run dry. Chapter 346. He Sanlang doesn't know how to placate his wife. 1. Not long after Chu Lian's carriage had left the camp, He Changdi came chasing after her on a horse with 2 of his subordinates in tow. There was a brazier burning within the carriage, but it was still cold and breezy. In the northern border, it was so cold that spit would turn into ice the moment it hit the ground. The fleece rug and blankets that had originally been placed inside the carriage had been used to replace He Changdi's bedding, so all that was left were bare wooden boards. Chu Lian wasn't used to the cold and hard interior yet. Wenqing heard the sound of hurried hoofbeats outside the carriage, so she lifted the curtain slightly to peek outside. Her face lit up with happiness and she turned to Chu Lian. While speaking, she adjusted the large fur cloak on her mistress properly. "Third young madam, third young master has come to send you off." Chu Lian was still angry at that lunatic husband of hers and had no desire to see him at this point. All she did was harumph in reaction to Wenqing's words. Wenqing started getting anxious when she saw third young madam's reaction. However, there was nothing she could do. Chu Lian was intent on stewing in her anger in the carriage. Meanwhile, He Sanlang had never been a man who was good at placating his wife, let alone after reincarnating from his previous life. The thought of shamelessly begging his wife for forgiveness had never even crossed his mind. Thus, he kept his face cold and continued following by Chu Lian's carriage on his horse, escorting her silently all the way back to the He estate in Liangju City. He dismounted from his horse and stood by the carriage. It wasn't until he finally saw Chu Lian as she was being helped down from the carriage by Wenlan, that his deep, dark gaze finally lit up with some life. He moved forward with some urgency, intending to help Chu Lian, but when he received a fierce glare from his wife in return, he pulled his hand back. As he was right now, He Sanlang looked like a poor dog who had been abandoned by his master. After Chu Lian glared at him, she simply walked straight into the He estate without Wenqing and Wenlan's support, treating He Changdi as if he was thin air. He Sanlang stood silently by the entrance of the estate as the cold winter winds blew past. The 2 subordinates who had followed after him lowered their heads with scared looks on their faces, afraid that their captain would turn around to take his anger out on them instead. Damn it, which brat had told them that there would be good food to eat if they accompanied the captain to the He estate? They were going to kill him when they got back to camp. He Changdi continued staring in the direction that Chu Lian had left in, his thin lips pressed tightly together. His hands curled into fists at his side. The small trace of warmth in his eyes disappeared and his expression turned cold and dark. Just like this, he stood by the entrance of the estate without going in nor leaving, as if the howling icy winds would be able to calm the swirling emotions in his heart. After 15 minutes, Chu Lian could no longer sit still. She wasn't the kind of girl to play cold wars with others anyway. She had done so with He Changdi because that fool had deserved it. When Wenqing noticed that third young madam seemed a little distracted, she quickly took the chance to ask, "Third young madam, we haven't heard any sound of hoofbeats. It's still snowing outside right now, wouldn't it be unbearable to stand out there in the cold? Third young master might be sent back out to the front lines to fight our enemies too." Before Wenqing could finish speaking, Chu Lian had already interrupted her. "Go out and give him some stuff." Seeing that third young madam had finally given in, Wenqing's face brightened up with joy. She quickly called Wenlan to follow her out to prepare a package. Just as they were about to leave, Chu Lian quickly added on, "Don't tell him that it was my order. I'm still angry here. And I haven't forgiven him. It's just, for the sake of his efforts on the front lines." Wenqing resisted the urge to smile and respectfully agreed. As Wenqing rushed towards the estate entrance with a package in hand, she spotted Manager Qin standing to one side awkwardly. When Manager Qin noticed her arrival, he reacted as if he had seen his savior. "Is young master still standing at the entrance?" Wenqing asked in a whisper. Manager Qin nodded with a troubled expression. Miss Wenqing, please try to convince third young master to return. Those two soldiers standing behind third young master look like they're about to freeze. Wenqing told him to return to the estate first, while she hurried towards the entrance. Chapter 347. He Sanlang doesn't know how to placate his wife. 2. He Changdi had been standing at the entrance with his hands to his back for quite some time by now. When he caught sight of Wenqing from the corner of his eyes, the hopes that he had been harboring secretly in his heart were dashed. By the time Wenqing finished bobbing in greeting to her young master, all that greeted her in return was her young master's icy voice. "What have you come here for?" Wenqing was afraid that third young master would mistake her intentions, so she quickly explained, "Third young master, this servant has come under third young madam's orders." He Sanlang's stiff expression relaxed a little upon hearing this. He shifted awkwardly on the spot before giving his best shot at feigning a casual tone. What did she say? Although Wenqing wanted to laugh, how could she possibly dare to do so? She presented the package to He Changdi with both hands. "Third young master, third young madam asks for you to return to camp quickly. These are some things that she had this servant prepare for you. Third young madam was afraid that you wouldn't have enough clothes to wear since you gave away your clothes today, so she had these 2 sets of new clothes prepared." As He Changdi took the package from Wenqing, his expression grew a little warmer. He hesitated for a moment, but he couldn't resist asking in the end, "Is your young madam still angry with me?" When Wenqing heard her master actually asking something like this, she took the chance to say, "Third young master, this servant has been serving by third young madam's side for some time now, so this servant understands third young madam's personality a little. Third young madam has always been friendly and easygoing, even with us lowly servants. She always meets everyone with a smile on her face. This servant has seen how much third young madam has suffered on the way here to the northern border, so this servant hopes that third young master might try to understand third young madam's plight." Wenqing's words made the regret in He Sanlang's heart grow even deeper. He pressed his lips together without speaking for a long moment. He finally said, "Go back and take good care of your young madam. Although her ankle is almost healed, she can't be careless with it." Even though He Changdi's voice was still the same, his tone had changed to a much warmer and gentler one. Wenqing knew that her persuasion had worked. She agreed with a lighter heart, "Please don't worry, third young master, this servant will take good care of third young madam." He Sanlang hooked his arm through the handle of the package and slung it onto his back. He mounted his horse and led his subordinates away from the He estate and back to camp. If Chu Lian were to find out that Wenqing had explained the situation like that to He Sanlang, she would surely award her maidservant with a huge eye roll. To be honest, on the whole journey here to the north, she really hadn't suffered much at all, excluding that sneak attack by the barbarians and 2 hoons. She had made enough preparations and Tang Yang was a capable man. They hadn't lacked for anything on the way here. Although they had traveled as fast as they could, it couldn't be compared to the harsh pace that army reinforcements had to travel at. She even had the free time to order Wenqing and Wenlan to cook something appetizing each time they had stopped for a break. All she had done on the journey here was to eat and look at the pretty scenery. It was much better than some budget backpacking trips back in the modern world. After urging his horse on with his whip, He Changdi finally managed to return to the main camp before the sun set. Once he reached his tent, he saw that a bunch of his good friends were all waiting for him within. Zhong Mai was met with He Changdi's terrible expression the moment he lifted the curtain flap and entered the tent. The corner of his lips curled up and he scared, we single bastards just don't get the same level of treatment as these happily married fools." He slapped Xiao Hongyu's shoulder as the poor lad was still searching around He Changdi's bed. "All right, that's enough. What are you still searching for? Those lewd drawings of yours are probably ash in the brazier by now." Xiao Hongyu immediately let out an anguished wail and collapsed onto He Changdi's soft bed. "Brother He, sister-in-law couldn't possibly have found that book, right?" He Sanlang had completely lost all of his dignity as a man in front of Chu Lian today. When Xiao Hongyu fearlessly reminded him of the incident, he sneered sinisterly. Author's note: Snow Mountain Mists. "Sanlang, you can't go on like this. Come here, mommy will teach you how to make your wife happy." He Sanlang, with a terrible expression, heh. Snow Mountain Mists, you brat, you have to work harder. You're still a virgin even now. Epsilon, 3 He Sanlang. Draws sword. Chapter 348, Green Jade Thumb Ring, 1. Xiao Hongyu immediately ducked behind Zhongmai after hearing such a sinister sound from Hichangdi. The wooden chair by the side table was taken up by Captain Guo. The tent was furnished very simply and there weren't any extra chairs around, so Hichangdi could only stand to one side once he joined the group. Captain Guo smiled and gave a meaningful look at the fleece blanket embroidered with flowers, which clearly didn't belong to a man, on Hichangdi's bed. He then patted the bedding folded up nearly on the side table and shook his head. I was worrying about Zixiang's health, having to sleep on such a cold bed all the time, so I requested for a new set of bedding from the great general. It looks like it's not needed anymore. After saying so, he tossed the bedding to Xiao Hongyu. How lucky for you, brat. Xiao Hongyu chuckled, but he didn't accept the bedding. He turned and pushed it into Zhong Mai's arms. Brother Zhong has some old injuries. We can't let him suffer the cold. I'm still young, so that fleece blanket that brother he gave me will be enough for me to pass this winter. The sun didn't shine much out here in the north and temperatures were extremely low. Although Captain Guo and Zhong Mai were only in their 30s and they looked healthy and strong in their armor, the many years of army life had already left unseen marks on their bodies. When it was cloudy, rainy, or cold, especially in this winter season, their old injuries would flare up. The court hadn't been able to send supplies to them, so they were severely lacking in not only food, but warm cotton-padded blankets and clothes to survive the winter. Great General Qian had not only personally met Chu Lian out of respect for the Empress Dowager, but also because the supplies that Chu Lian had brought over were just what they needed. Even now, many of the foot soldiers didn't have cotton-padded blankets or clothes. Most of them were using dried grass to make do. This was also why Captain Guo had to go to Great General Qian personally just to request for a set of bedding. If this were any other camp, they might still be able to ask the citizens nearby to donate some supplies. However, there weren't many people in the north they could ask for supplies from. Liangzhu was practically a shell of a city with only their troops left to defend it. Thus, the situation was looking quite bad. In the end, the bedding that Captain Guo had brought over ended up with Zhong Mai. Captain Guo shot a glance at the package that Hichangdi was carrying and smiled. Seeing how lovey-dovey you and your wife are is making me miss my own. I wonder how she and the kids are doing in the capital. All the routes over land or water had been blocked by the snows. Letters hadn't been able to pass through for some time. Even the officers like Captain Guo and the rest hadn't been able to receive any letters from home for a month or two. Captain Guo's words made the originally lively atmosphere in the camp quieten down to a dead silence. He Sanlang's thoughts were also drawn out. He thought of his grandmother back in the capital, as well as his sickly bedridden mother. In the end, Captain Guo realized that the air didn't seem right and tried to lighten the atmosphere. All right. What are you all thinking about? Our 50,000 brothers in arms here in the north all share the same fate now. If all our brothers start becoming as gloomy as you guys, then how are we going to fight off the Tuhuns? Xiao Hongyu rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath, and who was the one who mentioned that topic in the first place? Xiao Hongyu, I see that you're just bent on looking for trouble. I'll lose my temper on you. Captain Guo stood up and acted as if he was going to give Xiao Hongyu 2 black eyes. After playing around for a bit, the sad atmosphere from before completely dissipated. Chapter 349, Green Jade Thumb Ring, 2. Hichangdi suddenly spoke up. Brother Guo, the Tuhun army hasn't been attacking in full force for the past few days. This seemed like a good thing on the surface, almost like the Tuhuns had been scared off by them. While he had been battling on the front lines during the past few days, Hichangdi could clearly feel that the Tuhuns were no longer fighting as furiously. They only sent out small waves of soldiers to mount surprise attacks or harass them, as if they were trying to play for time. Captain Guo and the rest frowned. Captain Guo rapped the surface of the side table with his knuckles as he mused, Zixiang, what do you think they're trying to do? Although Hichangdi's features were handsome, His current expression was somber and grave. "They're trying to drag out the war. I'm afraid they already know about our lack of supplies." Captain Gu gave a huge start. Their supply routes were completely blocked, and none of the essential supplies they needed could be sent in. Once the enemies realized the border troop situation, they would become sitting ducks here, with only death awaiting them. By then, the two Huns wouldn't need to use a single soldier or arrow to capture all 50,000 border troops without resistance. After all, not everyone would be able to keep thinking of serving the country when faced with extreme hunger. Captain Gu abruptly stood up. He paced the tent with his hands behind his back in an impulsive mood. In a flash, he looked up and swept his gaze across the entire tent. "Continue chatting. I'm going to look for the great general. Remember to watch what you say." Actually, Captain Gu wasn't worried about any loose lips within this group. They were sworn brothers, after all. However, he had to give reminders when he could. Captain Gu took his cloak and rushed over to the entrance of the tent. He suddenly turned back and told He Changdi, "Zhixiang, General Sima sent over 2 soldiers for you to punish at night. Take a look at the tent next to this." After saying so, he lifted the tent flap and left in a flurry of wind. Since the atmosphere had turned so grave suddenly, the brothers no longer had any desire to chat. Zhong Mai bid them good night and took the bedding back to his own tent. He Changdi called one of the soldiers on duty outside and questioned him about what had happened for a moment. Following that, he ordered someone to send the 2 female soldiers back. He didn't want to think about what was going on with Sima Hui at this point, nor did he want to have any association with her at all. When he returned to camp, Xiao Hongyu came over with a face expecting some gossip. "Brother He, how was it? How did you deal with those 2 female soldiers? I peeked a bit earlier and one of them is quite pretty." He Sanlang sent a cool glance towards him. "I sent them back." "What? Brother He, you let such a tasty morsel slip through your fingers. Did you have something in mind?" Xiao Hongyu rubbed the back of his round head sheepishly. "Brother He, you have a wife, but I haven't married one yet." He Changdi snorted. "If you want them, go ask General Sima for them yourself." Xiao Hongyu stiffened up. "What, you want me to beg that tomboy for them? Forget it, it's better for me to be single." "Good that you realize that." Xiao Hongyu was instantly beaten into the dust by those words. He collapsed in his bed lifelessly. It was only now that He Changdi finally had the time to open up the package that Wenqing had given him. Xiao Hongyu secretly watched as He Sanlang opened up the package, prepared to snatch away anything tasty within. Unfortunately, he was left with disappointment. It was just some ordinary clothes within and an exquisite-looking wooden box. Xiao Hongyu rarely saw such fine-looking fragrant rosewood boxes, so driven by his curiosity, he came over to see. "Brother He, open it. I want to see what's inside." He Changdi lifted up the wooden box and examined it. The fragrant rosewood box was decorated with fine details. Its surface had been painted over in black and some auspicious patterns to draw luck for a prosperous career were carved onto it. If the box already looked this exquisite, then what about its contents? He Sanlang was a little phased. His deep gaze was fixed on the wooden box as if he were trying to see through it. He had seen this in his past life before. It was something that he was very familiar with. He already knew what was inside without opening it. A green Hatian jade thumb ring. The one that Xiaobo Jian had carried on his thumb, a perfect match with the one that Chu Lian had frequently worn. But now, it had landed in his hand. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.